The room went so quiet I could hear the ice melting in somebody's bourbon glass. "Young lady, are you aware he's married?" My father's voice wasn't loud. That was the frightening part. General Arthur Bennett had spent 40 years commanding men in war zones, briefing presidents, and standing in rooms where a whisper carried more weight than shouting ever could. Across my living room, the young blonde woman sitting beside my husband turned scarlet. Ethan said they were basically separated." "That's interesting," my father replied calmly. My husband went pale. "Sir, I can explain." I stood near the fireplace, gripping the edge of the mantel so hard my wedding ring cut into my skin. Just 20 minutes earlier, I'd been upstairs changing into pearl earrings for what Ethan told me was a small dinner gathering with potential business clients. Then I walked downstairs and found another woman sitting at my dining table drinking wine from my crystal glasses. Not just sitting there comfortably, smiling, like she belonged there. And my husband of 32 years, had the nerve to introduce her as someone important to his future. At 60 years old, I thought I understood humiliation. Marriage teaches you compromises, aging teaches you disappointments. But nothing prepares you for standing in your own home while the man you built a life with parades another woman through your front door like you're already invisible. Especially after everything you sacrificed for him. Especially after all the years you stayed quiet so he could feel important. I should probably tell you that my husband Ethan had no idea who my father really was. That sounds impossible, doesn't it? But it's true. When Ethan met me in 1993, I was teaching history at a small private school outside Alexandria, Virginia. My father had already retired from the Air Force by then. My parents lived quietly on a horse farm in Middleburg. No security detail, no flashy wealth, no newspaper interviews. My father hated attention. He always said real accomplishment didn't need an audience. So Ethan assumed my parents were simply reserved older Virginians with military manners and modest money. I never corrected him. Not because I was ashamed, quite the opposite. I loved that my parents valued simplicity. My mother still clipped grocery coupons despite having more money than most people in our county. My father drove an old Ford pickup and spent Saturday mornings repairing fences himself. That was the world I grew up in. Quiet dignity. Service before appearance. Character before status. Unfortunately, Ethan slowly became a different man. When we were younger, he was warm and ambitious in a charming way. He sold commercial real estate around Northern Virginia and dreamed of building something meaningful. I admired that about him. Back then, he laughed easily. He loved old jazz records and Sunday drives through the Shenandoah Valley. But success changed him little by little. Or maybe it simply revealed who he already was. As the years passed, Ethan became obsessed with appearances. Bigger houses, better clubs, more influential friends. He started measuring human value by job titles and dinner invitations. And lately he'd become fascinated with politics. Especially powerful people. 3 months earlier, he started mentioning Senator Marcus Whitmore constantly. Apparently, Whitmore's daughter worked in nonprofit fundraising and had excellent Washington connections. That daughter was now sitting in my living room wearing a cream-colored dress and looking terrified of my father. Her name was Vanessa. She couldn't have been older than 35. Young enough to still believe charm could rescue her from consequences. Ethan wiped nervous sweat from his forehead. "General Bennett, I never intended for this to become disrespectful." My mother finally spoke from beside the doorway. "Bringing your mistress into your wife's home usually qualifies as disrespectful." Her tone was elegant and composed, which somehow made it worse. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, had mastered the art of polite devastation decades ago. Vanessa stood abruptly clutching her purse. "I think I should leave." "Yes," my mother said immediately. "I believe you should." Vanessa looked at Ethan, probably expecting him to defend her. He didn't. Cowardice ages a man quickly. In those few minutes, Ethan suddenly looked older than his 64 years. His shoulders slumped. His confidence vanished. The polished businessman who spent years lecturing waiters and bragging at country club dinners looked like a frightened teenager caught stealing. Vanessa hurried toward the front door. Before leaving, she glanced at me with genuine embarrassment. Oddly enough, I didn't hate her. Not really. Because standing there looking at Ethan, I realized something painful. This wasn't about Vanessa. There would always have been another Vanessa eventually. Another younger woman to impress. Another audience for his ego. The real betrayal had begun years ago when Ethan stopped valuing the life we built together. The front door closed softly behind her. Silence settled across the room again. My father looked at Ethan steadily. "You threatened my daughter tonight." Ethan blinked quickly. "Sir, You told her not to anger a senator." My father took one slow step forward. "Son, I buried pilots before you finished college. Do not mistake me for a man intimidated by politicians." I almost closed my eyes at that moment because I recognized the voice. Calm, controlled, dangerous. The command voice. I hadn't heard it in years. Ethan swallowed hard. "Claire never told me." "No," my father interrupted. "She didn't. Because unlike some people, our family doesn't treat influence as decoration." My chest tightened unexpectedly. Even now, after walking into this disaster, my father wasn't bragging. He was defending values, defending me. That realization nearly broke me more than Ethan's betrayal. Because suddenly I understood how lonely I'd become inside my marriage. I used to make excuses for Ethan constantly. He's under stress. He didn't mean it that way. He's worried about retirement. But standing there that evening, I finally saw the truth clearly. A good man under pressure becomes tired. A selfish man under pressure reveals himself. My mother crossed the room and touched my arm gently. "Claire, sweetheart, when did you last eat?" Such a small question. Such a mother question. And for some reason, that was what finally cracked me open. I started crying right there beside the fireplace at 60 years old like a heartbroken girl. Not dramatic sobbing. Just exhausted tears. My father's expression softened instantly. Ethan stepped toward me. "Claire." I held up my hand. "No." One word. But it stopped him cold. Because for 32 years I had always eventually softened, always listened, always forgiven. This time was different. I looked directly at my husband. "You didn't just betray me, Ethan," I said quietly. "You humiliated me in my own home." His eyes filled with panic then. Real panic. Not because he suddenly loved me correctly. Because he finally understood he might actually lose me. And deep down, men like Ethan always assume there will be one more chance. He didn't know yet there wouldn't be. I barely slept that night. After my parents left the house, felt unfamiliar like a hotel room after an argument. The grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder than usual. Every creak in the floorboards made my nerves jump. Ethan slept downstairs in his office. Or at least I assumed he tried to. Around 3 in the morning, I walked quietly into the kitchen for tea and found him sitting alone at the table in darkness, staring into an untouched glass of scotch. For a moment he looked old. Not distinguished old, not confident old. Just tired. The kind of tired that settles into a man after he realizes the story he told himself about his life is collapsing. He looked up when I entered. "Claire." I said nothing and reached for the kettle. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I kept my eyes on the stove, for which part? The silence after that question stretched painfully. For all of it. I laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny, but because men often discover sincerity only after consequences arrive. 32 years of marriage teaches you how to hear the difference between guilt and regret. Guilt says I hurt you. Regret says I got caught. I still didn't know which one Ethan felt. He rubbed both hands over his face. "You have every right to hate me." "I don't hate you." That surprised both of us. Because it was true. Hatred requires energy. What I felt was something colder, a deep disappointment that hollowed me out from the inside. I poured hot water into my mug carefully. "You know what hurts most?" I asked quietly. Ethan looked up. "You thought I'd tolerate it." His jaw tightened. "You honestly believed you could bring another woman into this house and I'd stay quiet because her father was powerful." "Claire, that's not." That is exactly what happened. For years, Ethan had slowly mistaken my calmness for weakness. That realization hurt worse than the affair itself. When we were younger, Ethan used to admire my steadiness. He'd tell friends I could stay calm through anything. During hard years, his business failures in the early 2000s, my mother's cancer, scare the death of his older brother, I was the one who held our life together quietly. But somewhere along the line, my steadiness stopped looking like strength to him. It started looking like surrender. "I never meant to humiliate you," he whispered. I turned toward him finally. "Well, you did." Simple truth sounds heavier after midnight. He looked down again. "You don't understand how things got out of hand." I almost answered sharply. Instead, I sat across from him with my tea between my hands. "No," I said calmly, "I think I finally do." Outside the kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the glass. Northern Virginia rain in late October always carried a certain loneliness with it. Ethan stared toward the dark backyard. I felt invisible. There it was. Not love. Not passion. Vanity. "I'm 64 years old," he continued quietly. "Young people in this business look right through me now. New money, tech people, political donors, everyone chasing the next thing." I listened without interrupting. Then Vanessa started paying attention to me, laughing at my stories, asking for advice. His voice cracked slightly. She made me feel important again. That sentence told me everything. Not because it excused him, because it exposed him. I remembered the man I married at 31. Ethan had once been kind to everyone. He volunteered coaching Little League. He visited his mother every Sunday after church. He used to bring me daisies from roadside flower stands because he remembered I loved simple things. But over time, Ethan became addicted to admiration. And admiration is a dangerous drug for aging people. Especially in America, where growing older often makes people feel discarded. I softened slightly despite myself. Not enough to forgive him, but enough to understand him. And understanding someone after they hurt you can feel almost cruel. "You should have talked to me," I said quietly. "I know. But instead you chose humiliation." His eyes filled with shame. "I didn't think you'd ever leave." That sentence landed harder than the affair. Because it was true. Ethan had spent decades believing my loyalty was unconditional. And maybe I had taught him that. Not intentionally, but still. Women of my generation were raised differently. We were taught marriage required endurance, patience, sacrifice, quietness. Especially military daughters like me. My mother endured long deployments without complaint. She moved across countries repeatedly. She raised children alone during dangerous years while my father served overseas. Strength in our world looked quiet. Maybe too quiet sometimes. "I need some space," I finally said. Ethan nodded immediately, of course. "I mean real space." His face tightened. "You're leaving." "No, you are." He stared at me like the idea had genuinely never occurred to him. This was my house too, my kitchen, my life. And for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of my own dignity returning slowly to my spine. The next morning, Ethan packed 2 suitcases. Watching your husband fold sweaters into luggage after 32 years together feels surreal. Ordinary objects suddenly become evidence of failure. He paused at the bedroom doorway before leaving. "Claire, did you really never tell me about your family because you didn't care about status?" I looked up from the bed where I sat holding one of our old wedding albums. "Yes." His eyes searched mine. "I don't understand that." "I know." That was the tragedy of it. My father used to say character reveals itself most clearly through what people cannot understand. Ethan couldn't understand why power wasn't the center of our lives, which meant he never truly understood me either. After he left, the silence inside the house became enormous. I wandered room to room touching furniture, photographs, bookshelves. 32 years of marriage lived inside those walls. Family vacations. Christmas mornings. Dinner parties. Arguments. Recoveries. Promises. I stopped in front of our wedding portrait hanging in the hallway. We looked so young. So certain. For a brief moment, grief hit me so hard I had to sit down. Not grief for the man standing in my living room yesterday. Grief for the man I thought he used to be. Around noon, my mother arrived carrying homemade soup because of course she did. Mothers from her generation always brought food to heartbreak. She found me sitting at the dining table, still wearing the same sweater from the night before. Without a word, she placed the soup on the stove and sat beside me. Then she took my hand. And I cried again. Quietly this time. "I feel foolish," I whispered. My mother squeezed my fingers gently. "Claire Bennett," she said softly, "there is nothing foolish about loving someone fully." That sentence stayed with me. Because older women carry enough shame already. Shame about aging, about staying too long, about trusting too much. But maybe love itself was never the shameful part. Maybe betrayal belonged entirely to the betrayer. That afternoon my father called. "I've arranged for an attorney to meet with you whenever you're ready." I closed my eyes briefly. Dad believed in preparation, always. "You already knew this might happen, didn't you?" A pause. Then he answered honestly. "I knew Ethan was becoming the kind of man who valued appearances too much. That hurt because deep down I'd known it too. I just kept hoping love would correct it. But love doesn't change character. It only reveals it over time." 3 days after Ethan moved out, I met with the divorce attorney my father recommended. Her office sat in an old red brick building near Georgetown, elegant without trying too hard. The kind of place with polished wood floors, framed law degrees, and a receptionist who spoke softly enough to make everyone else lower their voices too. Her name was Diane Mercer. Late 60s, silver bob haircut, pearl earrings. Competence radiated off her like heat. "I knew your father years ago," she said as she poured coffee into thin white china cups, back when Washington still had adults in the room. That made me smile for the first time in days. Diane opened a thick folder in front of her. "Before we discuss strategy," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something important." I nodded. "Do you want revenge or do you want peace?" The question startled me. Because up until then I thought they were the same thing. I looked out the window toward the gray Potomac River below. "I don't know yet." Diane gave a slow understanding nod. "That's honest. Honest is good." Then she slid several financial documents across the desk toward me. I stared at them in confusion. "These are Ethan's business accounts," she explained, "and these are yours." Mine were significantly larger. I blinked several times. Even though I understood my family's financial structure generally, I had never focused much on the numbers. My father handled most investments through family trusts, established long before I was born. Diane adjusted her glasses. "Claire, do you realize your husband's company would have failed nearly 12 years ago without distributions from your personal trust?" I looked up sharply. "What?" She pointed calmly to several documents. Capital injections, quiet debt coverage, tax protections. Most of Ethan's major business recoveries were indirectly supported by your family assets. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Not because I doubted her. Because I suddenly understood something humiliating. Ethan had spent years acting superior while unknowingly surviving because of me. Or more accurately, because of the quiet stability my family provided. I never even told him, I murmured. Diane folded her hands carefully. "Your father requested discretion." That sounded exactly like him. No performance. No reminders. No making a man feel small. The Bennetts believed helping family quietly was part of responsibility. Unfortunately, some people mistake silent support for weakness. Diane studied me for a moment. "You still love him." It wasn't a question. And against all logic, tears burned my eyes again. Yes. That was the terrible part. Love doesn't disappear simply because trust does. People my age understand that better than younger generations sometimes do. After 32 years, a marriage becomes stitched into your nervous system. You don't just lose a spouse. You lose routines, shared language, history. You lose the witness to your life. Diane handed me a tissue gently. You can love someone and still leave them. I nodded slowly. That afternoon I drove aimlessly through Northern Virginia for nearly 2 hours. Past old churches, shopping centers, quiet suburban neighborhoods where Halloween decorations already sat on porches. Ordinary American life continued around me as if my world hadn't cracked open. I finally parked outside a small diner near Fairfax where Ethan and I used to eat breakfast after church on Sundays years ago. The waitress recognized me immediately. "Haven't seen you two in forever." The sentence hit harder than she intended. I forced a smile and ordered coffee. Sitting there alone in the booth, I found myself remembering the early years of our marriage before ambition hardened Ethan into someone restless and dissatisfied. Back then, we didn't have much money. Our first apartment had thin walls and unreliable heat. Ethan drove a used Buick with a door that only opened from the outside. We spent summers drinking cheap wine on the balcony while listening to baseball games on the radio. And we were happy. Or at least I thought we were. I remembered helping Ethan practice presentations late at night when he first entered commercial real estate. I edited proposals, balanced budgets, encouraged him after failed deals. When his first company nearly collapsed in 2008, he sat at our kitchen table crying quietly because he thought he'd failed me. I held his hand and said, "We'll survive." And we did. Because my father quietly arranged financial protections without Ethan ever knowing. Not to deceive him. To preserve his pride. I stared down into my coffee. The saddest part wasn't that Ethan never appreciated my family's help. The saddest part was that he never valued the woman standing beside him enough to notice her strength. That evening, my parents invited me to their farm for dinner. The Bennett farm sat outside Middleburg, surrounded by rolling fields, white fences, and old maple trees just beginning to turn gold with autumn. My father bought the property after retirement because he said, after decades of war rooms and military bases, he wanted silence. Real silence. Not Washington silence. As I pulled into the driveway, my father stood near the barn repairing a fence post himself, despite being 72 years old. Some men retire into golf memberships. My father retired into work boots. He waved as I approached. "How'd the meeting go?" "Expensive," I answered dryly. That earned a laugh. We walked slowly together toward the house. "You know," Dad said after a moment, "when I first met Ethan, I liked him." "I know. He loved you sincerely once." The ache in my chest returned immediately. "I think so too." Dad stopped walking. "Claire, people aren't only one thing. A man can love his wife and still become selfish." I looked at him carefully. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," he gave a tired smile, "just accurate." That was another thing about my father. Military command had stripped him of simplistic thinking decades ago. Life wasn't divided neatly into heroes and villains. Weakness and loneliness could corrupt people slowly over time. Inside the farmhouse, my mother made pot roast and fresh biscuits. The house smelled like rosemary and butter and wood smoke. Safe smells. Healing smells. At dinner, they didn't pressure me about the divorce. They didn't criticize Ethan endlessly either. That surprised me. Finally, halfway through dessert, I asked the question sitting heavily inside me. "Why didn't you ever tell Ethan who you really were?" My mother smiled softly. "Because we wanted him to love you for yourself. And if a man values you less because he thinks your family is ordinary," my father added quietly, "then eventually he'll reveal something ugly about himself." I lowered my eyes. He did. Dad reached across the table and squeezed my hand once. "Yes," he said gently, "he did." Later that night, after my parents went to bed, I sat alone on the farmhouse porch, wrapped in one of my mother's quilts. The Virginia countryside stretched dark and peaceful around me. For the first time since the dinner party, I realized something surprising. I wasn't afraid anymore. Heartbroken, yes. Embarrassed sometimes. Angry occasionally. But not afraid. Because somewhere underneath all the grief, I had started remembering who I was before I spent decades shrinking myself to protect a man's ego. And that woman, I realized quietly, was still there. A week later, I found myself standing beside my father at Arlington National Cemetery. The wind carried that particular October chill unique to Virginia, sharp enough to make you pull your coat tighter, gentle enough to remind you winter hadn't fully arrived yet. Rows of white headstones stretched across the hills in perfect order. Every time I came there, the silence humbled me. Not empty silence. Earned silence. My father walked slowly beside me with his hands folded behind his back. Even retired for nearly 15 years, he still moved like a military officer, measured, alert, disciplined. We stopped near the gravesite of one of his closest friends, a pilot he'd served with decades earlier. Dad crouched carefully despite his stiff knees and brushed a few fallen leaves from the headstone. "He never got to grow old," he said quietly. That sentence settled heavily between us. At 60, I'd started noticing how often conversations among older Americans turned toward time, retirement, illness, grandchildren, loss. We spend so much of youth imagining life ahead that eventually it shocks us to realize more years sit behind us than in front. Maybe that's why Ethan panicked. Not because he was evil. Because aging frightened him. Unfortunately, fear can make selfish people dangerous. "You still thinking about him?" my father asked gently as we continued walking. "Yes. That's normal." I gave him a sideways glance. You're remarkably calm about all this. Dad smiled faintly. Claire, I spent 40 years watching human beings make mistakes under pressure. Mistresses aren't exactly battlefield decisions. No, he admitted, but pride is pride, ego is ego. We walked quietly for a few moments. Then Dad stopped near a large oak tree overlooking the cemetery hills. You know what war teaches you eventually. I shook my head. Nobody is impressive forever. The breeze rustled through the branches above us. Titles disappear, he continued softly. Uniforms disappear, beauty disappears, strength fades. Character is what stays behind. I felt tears sting unexpectedly. Because deep down, I knew that was exactly what Ethan had lost sight of. And maybe what I had forgotten too. That afternoon, I drove to the Veterans Hospital in Washington for the first time in years. My mother volunteered there every Thursday, helping elderly spouses complete paperwork and insurance forms. After retirement, my father occasionally visited wounded veterans quietly without publicity. I used to help during holidays when life was less busy. Before my marriage became maintenance instead of partnership. The hospital smelled faintly of coffee disinfectant and old linoleum floors. Familiar somehow, honest. My mother greeted me warmly near the volunteer office. Oh good, she said immediately. Mrs. Talbot's hearing aid paperwork has become a nightmare. You're better at forms than I am. That made me laugh softly. And strangely, laughter felt unfamiliar now. Like using muscles I hadn't stretched in years. For the next few hours, I sat with elderly veterans and their families helping sort documents, insurance claims, transportation requests. Ordinary problems. Real problems. One man named Frank kept calling me young lady despite being only 15 years older than me. Another veteran showed me photographs of his grandchildren for 20 straight minutes while forgetting my name entirely. And somehow being around those people soothed something inside me. No performance. No social climbing. No pretending. Just human beings trying to carry life with dignity. Around 3 o'clock, a woman named Margaret sat beside me in the cafeteria. She looked to be in her 70s, sharp-eyed with short gray curls and a denim jacket covered in volunteer pins. You're Arthur Bennett's daughter, she said immediately. I nodded. He helped my husband years ago. Really? Margaret smiled warmly. My Harold came home from Vietnam carrying more ghosts than luggage. Your father got him into counseling before anybody else would admit veterans needed it. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. My father rarely talked about those years. Margaret stirred cream into her coffee slowly. Good men don't advertise kindness, she said. That's how you know it's real. I thought about Ethan instantly. About expensive dinners, loud networking events, constant conversations about influence and visibility. Somewhere along the line he'd confused attention with importance. Margaret tilted her head carefully. You look heartbroken. Older people stop pretending not to notice pain. I smiled sadly, that obvious. Honey, I'm 76, nothing subtle anymore. That made me laugh again. Then somehow I found myself telling her pieces of the story. Not every humiliating detail. Just enough. Margaret listened quietly without interrupting. Finally, she patted my hand. Men panic when they age, she said matter-of-factly. Some buy Corvettes, some chase younger women, some become grumpy old fools. And some grow wiser. I looked down at my coffee. I'm not sure Ethan will. Margaret shrugged gently. That's his tragedy, not yours. That sentence followed me home. 2 days later, Ethan called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. But after 32 years, ignoring his name on my phone felt impossible. Hello? His voice sounded tired immediately. Claire, thank you for not destroying me publicly. I frowned slightly. I never wanted to destroy you. A long pause. I think that somehow makes this worse. I leaned back slowly in my chair. How's the apartment? Small. That nearly made me smile despite myself. Ethan had always hated small spaces. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I lost the Franklin contract. I closed my eyes briefly. The Franklin contract was huge, nearly 40% of his consulting income. I'm sorry, I said automatically. And I meant it. That surprised me. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. You know what's pathetic? Half the people avoiding me now were never real friends to begin with. There it was. The loneliness underneath vanity. I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said quietly, "That's what happens when relationships are built on appearances." Silence. Then softly, "You warned me about that years ago." I remembered the conversation instantly. A charity gala in Georgetown nearly 12 years earlier. Ethan spent the entire evening chasing conversations with influential donors while ignoring longtime friends seated beside us. On the drive home, I told him, people who only value status eventually abandon each other the moment status disappears. At the time, he laughed it off. Now he sounded broken remembering it. "Claire," he said carefully, "did you ever feel invisible with me?" The question stunned me, because he had never asked anything like that before. And the truthful answer hurt. Yes. Silence filled the line again. Not defensive silence, painful silence. The kind older couples eventually recognize the silence that arrives when truth finally outweighs pride. When we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time staring out my living room window. Marriage is strange that way. Sometimes people don't really begin seeing each other clearly until everything falls apart. That evening, my mother called and invited me for Sunday dinner again. Before hanging up, she added gently, "Your father's making chili. Try to act impressed." I smiled to myself afterward. And for the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel entirely dark. Not healed. Not settled. But survivable. At our age, sometimes hope arrives quietly. Not as excitement. As peace. By early December, Ethan's business had officially begun to collapse. Not dramatically. That's the thing younger people misunderstand about failure. Most lives don't explode overnight. They erode quietly. One canceled contract. One unanswered phone call. One invitation that suddenly stops arriving. At our age, you notice those absences immediately. Ethan certainly did. I heard pieces of the story through mutual friends first. A developer in McLean ended their consulting agreement. 2 longtime clients moved to another firm. A charity board quietly replaced him before the annual gala. Washington has always specialized in elegant exile. Nobody says you're unwelcome. They simply stop calling. I wish I could tell you I enjoyed hearing about it. Part of me expected revenge to feel satisfying, but mostly it felt sad. 32 years is a long time to watch someone slowly become a stranger. One rainy afternoon, Ethan came by the house to collect more belongings. I nearly didn't open the door when I saw him standing there through the window. He looked thinner. His expensive camel overcoat hung loosely around his shoulders, and for the first time in decades, his hair looked genuinely gray instead of carefully managed. Aging arrives quickly once vanity loses its audience. "Hi," he said awkwardly when I opened the door. "Hello?" For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I stepped aside silently. He walked into the foyer slowly, like a visitor instead of a husband. The Christmas decorations were already up. Garland along the staircase. White lights around the mantel. The same decorations I'd unpacked every December since 1994. Ethan stared at them quietly. "You always made Christmas beautiful." The comment hit me unexpectedly hard. Because it was true. For decades, I created warmth around him while he chased admiration elsewhere. He walked upstairs while I remained in the kitchen pretending to organize mail. A few minutes later, I heard drawers opening in the bedroom. Then silence. Then another drawer. 32 years of shared life reduced to deciding which sweaters belonged to whom. Eventually, he came downstairs carrying 2 boxes. He paused near the dining room doorway. "Do you remember our first Christmas here?" Of course I remembered. We bought the house in 1998 after years of saving. It wasn't enormous by Washington standards, but I loved it immediately. Wide front porch, tall windows, old oak trees in the backyard. That first Christmas, we couldn't afford proper furniture yet, so we ate dinner sitting on folding chairs beside the fireplace. "Yes," I answered quietly. Ethan gave a tired smile. "You made tomato soup because we spent all our money on the down payment. And you burned the grilled cheese sandwiches." "That too." For one painful second, the old version of us returned. Not the polished couple from charity galas. Just 2 people trying to build a life together. Then reality settled back into the room again. Ethan looked down. "I threw away something good, didn't I?" I answered honestly. "Yes." His eyes closed briefly. I keep thinking if I explain myself correctly, maybe this will make sense somehow. It won't. He nodded slowly like he already knew that. Then he looked at me carefully. Do you hate her? Vanessa. He nodded. I surprised myself by answering immediately. No. That seemed to genuinely confuse him. She knew you were married, he said quietly. Yes, but she didn't stand before me 32 years ago and promise loyalty. That landed. Hard. Ethan looked away toward the Christmas tree blinking softly in the corner. I don't think I understood what loyalty cost you. The sentence settled heavily between us. Because women of my generation understand loyalty differently than many younger people do. We stayed through layoffs, illness, aging parents, financial strain, exhaustion, quiet disappointments. We kept marriages alive through ordinary endurance. Not because we were weak, because we believed commitment mattered. And maybe sometimes we tolerated too much because of it. I wasn't unhappy all those years, Ethan said suddenly. I looked at him. That almost makes this worse. His face crumpled slightly. I know. Before leaving, he hesitated near the front door. The apartment feels empty. I folded my arms gently. That's what consequences feel like sometimes. He nodded once and walked out into the rain carrying his boxes. I watched from the doorway until his car disappeared down the street. Then I closed the door and stood there crying quietly where he couldn't see me. Not because I wanted him back. Because grief doesn't disappear simply because betrayal exists. A week later, I finalized preliminary divorce agreements with Diane Mercer. We sat together in her office reviewing financial settlements. You're being extremely generous, Diane observed carefully. I don't need to punish him financially. She studied me over her glasses. You could. I know. And I could have. Legally, much of Ethan's lifestyle had depended indirectly on structures connected to my family's trusts and investments. But stripping him completely felt cruel. My father was surprised when I told him my decision later that evening. You owe him nothing, he said firmly. Maybe not. Dad looked at me carefully across the farmhouse kitchen table. Then why? I stared down at my coffee for a long moment before answering. Because I loved him once. The room grew quiet. My mother reached over and touched my hand softly. Mercy becomes easier once anger finishes burning. That doesn't mean forgiveness arrives quickly. Only that revenge eventually grows exhausting. A few days before Christmas, Ethan called again. This time his voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. I lost the apartment. I sat upright immediately. What happened? I can't afford it anymore. The words seemed painful for him to say aloud. A man who spent years projecting success now admitting financial instability. I found a smaller place in Arlington, he added quickly. It's temporary. I leaned back slowly. Do you need help moving? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Long silence. Then very quietly. Why are you still kind to me? I looked out the window toward falling snow beginning to cover the backyard. Because despite everything, kindness still felt more natural to me than cruelty. Because being cruel won't heal me, I answered honestly. He made a sound that almost resembled breaking. That Christmas Eve, I spent the evening at my parents' farmhouse. The house glowed warmly against the cold Virginia night. My mother baked pecan pie while old Nat King Cole records played softly in the background. My father fell asleep in his armchair halfway through a football game. Ordinary things. Comforting things. At one point, I stood alone by the window watching snow drift across the fields. And suddenly I realized something important. For months I'd been thinking of my life as something destroyed. But maybe it wasn't destroyed. Maybe it was simply changing shape. Painfully. Unexpectedly. But not hopelessly. At 60 years old, that realization felt strangely liberating. Because there's still life after heartbreak. Still purpose after disappointment. Still peace waiting somewhere beyond humiliation. You just have to survive long enough to reach it. By February, the sharpest part of winter had settled over Virginia. The trees outside my bedroom window stood bare and skeletal against pale morning skies, and the quiet after snowfall seemed to soften everything, even grief. I had moved into a smaller home by then. Not because I needed to financially. Because I wanted simplicity. After Ethan left, the old house began feeling too large for one person. Too full of echoes. Every hallway carried memories I wasn't ready to trip over daily. So I bought a modest historic cottage near Middleburg, only 15 minutes from my parents' farm. White shutters, stone walkway, small library room with built-in shelves I immediately loved. For the first time in years, the house belonged entirely to me. No entertaining schedules, no business dinners, no pretending. Just peace. Most mornings I drank coffee beside the kitchen window while watching birds gather near the feeder outside. It sounds small, but after decades of tension, I'd barely acknowledged quiet became a kind of medicine. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteered at the Veterans Center with my mother. That's where I met Daniel Harper. The first thing I noticed about Daniel was his voice. Calm voices matter when you get older. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, without the exhausting performance so many people carry now. A retired Navy physician in his late 60s, Daniel volunteered twice a week helping elderly veterans navigate medical paperwork and transportation issues. The second thing I noticed was that he listened fully when people spoke. That quality has become rare. We met over a broken coffee machine in the volunteer lounge. "It only works if you threaten it first," he told me solemnly while smacking the side lightly. To my surprise, the machine sputtered back to life immediately. I laughed. Years of medical training. Navy medicine, he corrected. We learned improvisation. His smile was warm but unassuming. No flashy charm. No effort to impress. And after everything with Ethan, that steadiness felt unexpectedly comforting. Over the following weeks, Daniel and I developed an easy friendship. We ate lunch together sometimes in the hospital cafeteria, talking mostly about ordinary things. Books. Music. Adult children leaving home. The strange invisibility that comes with aging in America. Daniel had been widowed 6 years earlier after nearly 40 years of marriage. She hated hospitals, he told me once with amused sadness, which was inconvenient considering she married a doctor. I smiled softly. "Were you happy?" "With her?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, not every day, but overall yes." That answer stayed with me because it sounded honest. Not romanticized. Real. Older people understand happiness differently. We stop expecting constant excitement. We begin valuing consistency, safety, companionship. Peace becomes more attractive than passion eventually. One afternoon after volunteering, Daniel and I walked slowly through downtown Middleburg, carrying cups of coffee while snow melted along the sidewalks. "You seem lighter lately," he observed gently. I looked at him carefully. "I think I'm finally breathing normally again." He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. "Long marriages can become heavy," he said quietly, "even good ones." I appreciated that he didn't immediately criticize Ethan. Most people wanted villains and victims because simple stories feel easier to process. But real marriages rarely collapse from one moment alone. Sometimes they erode slowly under unspoken disappointments. Meanwhile, Ethan had started seeing a therapist. I learned that accidentally during one of our occasional phone calls regarding financial paperwork. "I almost walked out after 10 minutes, he admitted awkwardly. I nearly smiled imagining it. Ethan hated vulnerability. "What changed your mind?" The line stayed quiet briefly. "The therapist asked me why I needed strangers to admire me so badly." That sounded uncomfortably accurate. And apparently the answer takes 50-minute sessions to explain. For the first time in months, I heard genuine self-awareness in his voice. Not excuses. Not blame. Reflection. Healing often begins with humiliation, unfortunately. Especially for proud people. Around that same time, Ethan reconnected with his younger brother Michael after nearly 7 years of estrangement. The brothers stopped speaking over something ridiculous involving inheritance disagreements after Ethan's mother died. Pride destroys families in slow motion. One Sunday evening, Ethan called unexpectedly while I cooked soup in my small kitchen. I had dinner with Michael. I stirred the pot slowly. How'd it go? He hugged me. Emotion cracked unexpectedly in his voice. "We haven't hugged since Dad's funeral." I leaned quietly against the counter. He said something interesting. "What?" He said I spent years chasing people who didn't care about me while ignoring the ones who did. The truth sounded painful even secondhand. Outside my kitchen window, snow began falling softly again. "I think he's right," Ethan whispered. That conversation haunted me afterward. Because despite everything, part of me still mourned for the man Ethan could have remained if he'd valued the right things. A few days later, my father came by the cottage carrying groceries I didn't ask for because retired military fathers apparently express love through unnecessary supplies. "You living entirely on soup now?" he asked suspiciously while unpacking canned goods. "I'm 60, not 23. Your cooking habits suggest otherwise." I laughed and handed him coffee. Dad wandered slowly through the cottage approvingly. "This place suits you." "I think so too." He stopped beside the bookshelf in the living room. "You seem peaceful." The observation surprised me because it was true. Not fully healed, but steadier. "I spent years shrinking parts of myself without realizing it," I admitted quietly. Dad nodded once. "That happens in marriages sometimes." I kept protecting Ethan's ego. "And who protected yours?" The question hit deep. Because I genuinely didn't know. Women of my generation were often taught emotional caretaking so thoroughly that eventually we stopped noticing our own exhaustion. Dad sat heavily in the armchair near the window. "You know why your mother and I survived all these years?" I smiled faintly, fear. "That too." Then his expression softened warmly. "But mostly because neither of us needed the world to constantly prove our value." That was the difference. My parents built their marriage around partnership. Ethan built much of his identity around validation. And validation disappears quickly with age. That evening after Dad left, I sat quietly by the fireplace thinking about the strange shape life had taken. 6 months earlier, I believed my marriage defined me completely. Now I was learning something unexpected. There could still be joy after betrayal. Still friendship. Still meaning. Still mornings filled with peace instead of anxiety. At 60 years old, I had assumed most major transformations were behind me. Instead, life quietly handed me another beginning. And for the first time in a very long while, I wasn't afraid of the future anymore. 1 year after Ethan brought Vanessa into my home, autumn returned to Virginia. The maple trees around Middleburg had turned deep shades of gold and rust again, and cool air drifted through open windows carrying the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. I used to think heartbreak permanently divided life into before and after. Now I understood something gentler. Life keeps moving. Not because pain disappears, because people learn how to carry it differently. That October evening, I attended a military charity fundraiser in Washington, honoring veterans and long-term military spouses. My mother convinced me to go after 3 days of persistent encouragement, and one particularly effective guilt trip involving her homemade lemon cake. Daniel attended with me. Not as some dramatic late-life romance. Just quietly. Comfortably. That mattered more. At our age, companionship becomes less about fireworks and more about ease. Daniel never tried to rescue me from my sadness or compete with my memories. He simply showed up consistently, which I had come to realize was one of the purest forms of love. The ballroom overlooked the Potomac River, glowing softly beneath crystal chandeliers and muted conversations. Retired officers, diplomats, widows, volunteers, and old military families filled the room. Familiar worlds. Steady worlds. Daniel handed me a glass of sparkling water. "You nervous?" "A little." "You'll survive." That sounds medically reassuring. Navy medicine specialized in confidence over certainty. I laughed softly. Then I saw Ethan standing near the far side of the ballroom. For one suspended moment, everything inside me went still. He looked older. Not ruined. Just humbled. His hair had gone almost entirely gray now, and the sharp arrogance he once carried so naturally had disappeared. Instead, he stood quietly speaking with an elderly veteran in a wheelchair. Listening carefully. Actually listening. Daniel noticed my expression immediately. "That him?" "Yes." He nodded gently. "You want to leave?" I considered it honestly, then shook my head. "No." Because healing eventually means reclaiming spaces that once hurt you, not avoiding them forever. About 20 minutes later, Ethan approached carefully. "Claire." "Hello, Ethan." His eyes shifted politely toward Daniel. "Good evening." Daniel extended his hand immediately. "Daniel Harper." "Ethan Collins." The men shook hands calmly. No hostility. No territorial tension. Just two older men understanding life had already humbled both of them in different ways. "I'll go rescue your mother from political conversations," Daniel told me quietly before stepping away. God, I appreciated that man. Ethan watched him go. "He seems kind." "He is." For a moment we stood together awkwardly beside the ballroom windows overlooking the river. Then Ethan exhaled slowly. "I almost didn't come tonight." "Why did you?" He looked down briefly. "I volunteer with a veterans housing program now. They invited me." I nodded softly. I heard. Over the past several months, Ethan had begun working with struggling veterans through a community outreach organization. At first, I assumed guilt drove him there. Maybe it did. But sometimes people begin changing for imperfect reasons and still become better. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I folded my hands together patiently. A real one this time. The honesty in that sentence immediately caught my attention. No excuses. No self-pity. Just accountability. Ethan swallowed hard. "What I did to you was cruel, not just selfish. Cruel." Emotion flickered across his face. I humiliated the person who loved me most because I was terrified of getting older and becoming irrelevant. I stayed silent. Not to punish him. To let him continue. I spent years needing strangers to admire me because somewhere along the line I stopped respecting myself. His voice lowered further. "And instead of facing that, honestly, I hurt you." There it was. The truth at last. Simple. Uncomfortable. Real. The ballroom noise softened around us as if distance suddenly separated us from everyone else. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added quickly. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked. And for the first time in years I saw no performance left in him. Just an aging man finally confronting himself honestly. Something inside me loosened quietly. Not romantic love? That chapter had ended. But bitterness. The heavy bitterness I'd carried for so long. "I forgive you," I said softly. His eyes filled immediately. Not dramatic tears. Just grief. Relief. Humility. "Thank you," he whispered. I surprised myself by smiling faintly. "Forgiveness isn't permission, Ethan." "I know. It's just freedom." He nodded slowly like someone memorizing the sentence. A few minutes later my father approached us. Even retired generals remain impossible to ignore in crowded rooms. Dad still carried authority naturally despite his age and stiffening knees. Ethan straightened immediately out of instinct. Dad studied him quietly for several seconds. Then he spoke. "A man is measured by what he does after failure." Simple words. But my father always preferred truth without decoration. Ethan nodded carefully. "I'm trying, sir." Dad's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That matters." And just like that, the war between them quietly ended. Not through dramatic reconciliation. Through maturity. Through time. Through acceptance that flawed people can still choose dignity afterward. Later that evening, Daniel drove me home through dark Virginia roads lined with glowing porch lights and autumn trees. "You okay?" he asked gently. I looked out the passenger window for a moment before answering. Yes. And I meant it. For the first time since my marriage collapsed, the story no longer felt unfinished. A week later, my parents invited everyone to the farmhouse for Sunday dinner. Not Ethan. Just family. My mother made roast chicken while my father complained about football rankings with the seriousness of international diplomacy. Daniel helped me wash dishes afterward while jazz music played softly through the kitchen. At one point, I glanced through the window toward the porch. My parents sat side by side beneath wool blankets watching the sunset over the fields. Their hands rested together naturally after nearly 50 years of marriage. No performance. No audience. Just loyalty weathered into tenderness over time. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me 60 years to fully learn. Real strength isn't loud. It isn't political influence or money or social status. It's the quiet courage to remain decent in a world constantly tempting people toward selfishness. It's choosing loyalty when nobody applauds for it. It's surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. It's allowing yourself to begin again after humiliation. Even late in life. Especially late in life. So, if you're listening to this story tonight, carrying heartbreak, regret, or disappointment of your own, I hope you remember something important. The people who appear quietest are often carrying the strongest foundations. And sometimes losing the life you expected becomes the first step toward finding peace you never thought possible. If this story touched you in some way, share it with someone who may need the reminder that dignity, kindness, and second chances still matter. And if you'd like more stories about resilience, family, and finding hope later in life, I'd be honored for you to stay a while longer. At the will, reading my dad declared the penthouse and Tesla go to your brother, not you. I didn't blink. I didn't argue. I just folded my hands in my lap, looked him straight in the eye and said calm as still water. Keep it all. A few people in the room shifted in their seats. Someone near the back let out a quiet, confused laugh like they weren't sure if they'd heard me right. My brother leaned back smiling. Not a cruel smile, not exactly. Just satisfied. Like everything had finally fallen into place the way it was always supposed to. My father nodded once as if my response confirmed something he had believed about me for years. She understands, he said, glancing toward the attorney. She's always been independent. Independent. That was the word he used. Not overlooked, not dismissed, not forgotten. Independent. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room pressing against me, extended family neighbors, 2 of my father's business associates, and a couple of people I didn't even recognize. They were all waiting for something. A reaction. A crack. But I had learned a long time ago how to hold still when everything inside me was shifting. They thought I'd lost my mind. They didn't know I'd already won. My father adjusted his tie, the same small, precise motion he'd made my entire life whenever he felt in control of a situation. He glanced down at the document in front of him, then at the attorney. Well, he said almost casually, that should settle everything. The attorney didn't answer right away. He was an older man, mid-60s, maybe thin, careful with a voice that always sounded like it had something more behind it than what he actually said. He flipped a page. Paused. Then he cleared his throat. Mr. Whitaker, he said, measured and professional, there is an additional document your father left behind. The room changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. My brother's smile faltered just slightly. My father frowned. What do you mean, he asked. The attorney adjusted his glasses. A separate directive. It was filed independently and is to be read after the primary will. There was a silence then. The kind that doesn't come from confusion but from something deeper, something people don't quite understand yet but feel shifting under their feet. I sat there, hands still folded, breathing steady. Because I knew, or at least I suspected. And for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to remember his voice. You don't need their approval, my grandfather had told me once. Just become someone they can't ignore. I'm 35 years old. A commissioned officer in the United States Navy. I've spent most of my adult life away from this town, away from this house, this table, these conversations that always seemed to circle around things I was never quite part of. My brother stayed. He built a business with my father, expanded it, made it profitable. He was visible. He was present. He was understandable. I wasn't. When I left for the military, my father didn't stop me. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, if that's what you want. And that was it. No pride. No concern. Just quiet acceptance, as if I'd chosen something temporary, something that would eventually pass. It never did. My grandfather was the only one who ever asked me why. Not in a demanding way, not like he was trying to test me. He asked because he wanted to understand. We used to sit on his back porch in the late afternoons when the sun dipped low enough to soften everything. He'd pour 2 glasses of iced tea, too sweet for my taste, but I never said anything and we'd talk. You ever notice he said once how people respect what they can see? I nodded. They see your brother's office, his car, his numbers. That makes sense to them. He tapped the side of his glass lightly. But service, that's harder. It doesn't show up in the same way. I remember looking at him then, trying to decide if he was warning me or encouraging me. What if they never see it, I asked. He smiled, not a big smile, just something small and certain. Then you make sure it's worth it anyway. The day I told my family I was enlisting, my brother laughed. Not harshly, just surprised. You, he said, you're serious. My father didn't laugh. He just leaned back in his chair studying me like I was a problem he hadn't quite figured out yet. It's a hard life, he said. I know. You'll be gone most of the time. I know. He nodded once. Then he looked past me toward the window. Well, he said, it's your decision. That was the moment I understood something I didn't have words for yet. I wasn't stepping away from them. I had never really been standing where they were to begin with. My grandfather drove me to the recruiter's office. He didn't say much on the way, just kept both hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward. When we pulled into the parking lot, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an old watch. It wasn't expensive, you could tell that just by looking at it. But it was clean, maintained, cared for. This was mine, he said. Wore it for 30 years. I hesitated. I can't take that. He pressed it into my hand anyway. You're not taking it, he said. You're carrying it. I looked down at it, then back at him. Why me? He held my gaze for a moment. Because you understand the difference. Years passed. Deployments came and went. Promotions, 2 quiet ones, earned the long way. I missed holidays, birthdays, dinners that from what I heard later weren't much different without me. I sent money home sometimes, not because they asked, just because it felt like something you do for family. No one ever mentioned it. My father would talk about my brother's latest expansion, his new clients, his plans. When he spoke about me, it was usually brief. She's doing fine, he'd say. Fine. The last time I spoke to my grandfather, I was standing outside a base in Virginia, the wind cutting sharp across the pavement. He sounded tired. But clear. How are you holding up, he asked. I'm good, I said, just busy. He chuckled softly. Busy's a good thing. There was a pause. Then he said something I didn't expect. I'm proud of you. I closed my eyes for a second. Thank you, I said. We talked a little longer, nothing important, just small things. When the call ended, I told myself I'd call him back in a few days. I didn't. By the time I did, it was too late. I didn't make it home for his funeral. Duty didn't allow it. That's the phrase they use. As if it explains everything. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. A week later, I received a letter. Handwritten. Short. Stand tall, even when no one's watching. That was all it said. No signature. It didn't need one. Now I was sitting in that same town again. In a room full of people who had never quite known what to do with me. Listening to my father distribute everything he believed mattered. And realizing he hadn't changed. Not really. But maybe he was about to. Because the attorney was still holding that second document. And for the first time in a very long time. My father looked uncertain. I didn't move when the attorney lifted the second document. For a moment, no one did. It was a strange kind of stillness, like the air had shifted but hadn't quite settled yet. My father's hand rested flat against the table, fingers spread just slightly as if grounding himself in something solid. What is that, he asked. His voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't demanding. It was unfamiliar. The attorney glanced down, then back up. This, he said carefully, is a separate directive filed by your father, Mr. Whitaker. It is to be read in full without interruption. My brother let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost amused again, trying to recover that earlier confidence. Well, he said lightly, I guess Grandpa had one more thing to say. No one laughed this time. I kept my eyes on the attorney's hands. The way he handled the paper, slow, deliberate, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an afterthought. This mattered. My grandfather never rushed anything. Not conversations, not decisions, not even silence. Especially not silence. He used to say that silence was where people showed you who they really were when they weren't trying to fill the space. We spent a lot of those silences together. On his porch, in his truck, sitting side by side watching the world move without feeling the need to explain it. You ever notice he said once how most people talk so they won't have to think? I smiled. You talk less than anyone I know. That's because I already did my thinking, he said. He was a quiet man. Worked with his hands most of his life, fixed things, built things, took care of what was his without making a show of it. When I was a kid, I thought that meant he didn't have much. It took me years to realize he had more than anyone else in that family. He just didn't measure it the same way. The attorney unfolded the paper. Before I begin, he said I need to clarify that this directive establishes a trust and outlines specific responsibilities assigned by the decedent. My father straightened. A trust, he repeated. Yes, sir. My brother leaned forward slightly, now interest replacing ease. What kind of trust, he asked. The attorney didn't answer right away. Instead, he began to read. I, Thomas Whitaker, being of sound mind. The words were formal, legal, structured. But beneath them, if you knew how to listen, there was something else. Something human. I remembered the first time my grandfather showed me how to fix a broken hinge. I must have been 10. He didn't take the tool from my hand when I struggled, didn't step in when I got frustrated. He just stood there beside me. You'll get it, he said. I'm doing it wrong, I snapped. He shook his head. You're doing it your way, that's different. I tried again. Slower this time. When it finally worked, I looked up at him, waiting. He nodded once. That's it. No applause, no big reaction. Just recognition. And somehow, that meant more. This trust is to be named the Whitaker Service Fund. There was a small shift in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable. My brother's brow furrowed. My father's expression tightened. Its purpose shall be to provide financial assistance and support to veterans and their families. Someone near the back whispered something under their breath. I didn't turn to see who. With an emphasis on those who have served without recognition or adequate support upon return to civilian life. My throat tightened slightly. Not from surprise. From understanding. He never talked about his own service. Not really. I knew he'd served, knew he'd seen things he didn't share. But he never wore it like a badge. He carried it like something private. Something earned but not displayed. The management and full discretionary control of this trust shall be granted to my granddaughter. The attorney paused. Just for a second. Then he looked up. Emily Whitaker. Every head in the room turned. I didn't move. Didn't react. But I could feel it, that shift. The one I'd felt my whole life, just reversed. My brother blinked. Wait, he said. What? My father didn't speak. He was looking at me now. Really looking? For the first time in a long time. This decision is made with full confidence in her judgment, character, and understanding of service. The attorney continued, his voice steady. Qualities which I have observed consistently throughout her life. I closed my eyes briefly. Just for a second. Because I could hear it. Not the attorney's voice. His. You don't need them to understand, my grandfather had told me once. We were sitting in his truck that day, rain tapping softly against the windshield. You just need to understand yourself. What if that's not enough, I asked. He looked at me calm as ever. It will be, he said, eventually. Along with the trust, I leave a personal letter to be read aloud at this time. The attorney lowered the document slightly, then reached for a second page. My father shifted in his seat. This is unnecessary, he said quietly. The attorney didn't respond. He just began to read. If you are hearing this, then I am gone. And if I know this family the way I believe I do, then there is already a misunderstanding in the room. A few people exchanged glances. My brother leaned back again, but there was no smile now. I have watched each of you build your lives in your own way. Some of you have built with numbers, some with presence, and one of you, the attorney paused briefly, has built with sacrifice. The room was silent, completely silent. Emily, he read, you chose a path that does not always come with recognition. That is the nature of it. I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain. Not quite. Something older. Deeper. Your family may not always understand what you have given, not because they do not care, but because they measure differently. My father's jaw tightened. I am leaving you this responsibility not as a burden, but as acknowledgement. The word hung there. Acknowledgement. You have already proven that you do not need more to carry. What you deserve. A pause. Is to be seen. The attorney lowered the paper. No one spoke. No one moved. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Just like before. But something had changed. Not in the room. Not yet. But in the way they were looking at me. My brother exhaled slowly. So, what she gets a charity, he said, trying to make sense of it. The attorney answered calmly. She receives full control of a funded trust with significant assets. That landed differently. My father finally spoke. How significant, he asked. The attorney met his eyes. Enough to matter. Silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something none of them had expected to face. I looked down at my hands. Then at the old watch on my wrist. Still ticking. Still steady. Just like he always was. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I realized something clearly. I hadn't just been given something. I had been recognized. The room didn't recover right away. It just sat there with what had been said. You could feel it settling into people differently, some trying to understand it, some trying to measure it, and a few trying to decide whether it mattered at all. My father was still looking at me. Not with anger, not even with disappointment. With something quieter. Something that didn't have a name yet. The attorney gathered the pages, aligning the edges carefully as if the order of things still mattered. If there are no further questions, he said, we can proceed with the formal transfer process in the coming weeks. My brother leaned forward. I have a question, he said. Of course he did. How is this funded, he asked. I mean, where is the money coming from? The attorney met his gaze without hesitation. Your grandfather allocated a portion of his private holdings to establish the trust, he said. Investments, land interests, and several long-term accounts. My brother blinked. That's not possible, he said. We went over everything. You reviewed the primary estate, the attorney replied. This was structured separately. I could see it then the moment my brother realized something had existed in that family that he hadn't been part of. Not excluded. Just never invited into. We left the house in small groups. People always do that after something uncomfortable. They don't leave all at once. They break apart quietly like a gathering that no longer knows what it's supposed to be. A few relatives stopped me on the way out. Congratulations, one of them said, though it didn't quite sound like congratulations. That's something another added, unsure of the word. I nodded politely. Thank you. That was enough. It always had been. The air outside felt different. Cooler, cleaner. I stood on the front steps for a moment, letting it settle. This house had never quite felt like mine. Even growing up, it had always belonged more to the idea of a family than to the people inside it. My brother's voice came from behind me. So he said. I turned. He had his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly tense. That was unexpected, he added. It was, I said. He studied me for a second. You knew, he asked. I shook my head. Number. He frowned. But you didn't seem surprised. I considered that. I wasn't, I said. He looked away down the driveway. I don't get it, he said. Why you? There was no accusation in it. Just confusion. I could have given him an answer. Explained the years, the distance, the choices. But none of that would have made sense to him, not in the way he needed it to. So I just said you'd have to ask him. My brother let out a quiet breath. Yeah, he said. Guess I can't do that anymore. My father didn't come outside right away. I didn't expect him to. He was the kind of man who needed time not to feel something, but to understand what it meant. I walked down the steps and toward the driveway. My car was parked along the curb, same place it had been when I arrived that morning. Nothing about it had changed. And yet everything had. The drive back took me past the old roads I used to know by heart. The grocery store on the corner, the gas station where my grandfather used to stop every Friday. The small park where nothing ever seemed to happen but where everything felt remembered. I pulled over once. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. The watch on my wrist caught the light as I turned the steering wheel. Still ticking. Still steady. The first time I wore that watch on base, one of the younger officers noticed it. Nice piece, he said. Where'd you get it? My grandfather, I told him. He nodded, impressed. Looks old. It is. He smiled. Still works, though. I looked down at it. Yeah, I said, it does. Military life isn't what most people think it is. It's not constant action. It's not glory. It's routine. Responsibility. Long stretches of quiet work that no one ever hears about. You wake up early, you follow orders, you lead when it's your turn, you take care of the people under you. And you learn over time that recognition isn't part of the job description. That's not why you do it. But there are moments, small ones, when someone looks at you, not for what you rank, not for what you've done on paper, but for how you carry yourself. Those moments stay with you. They build something, not visible, but real. I remember one deployment where things didn't go the way they were supposed to. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would write about. Just a situation that required someone to stay steady when others couldn't. After it was over, one of the enlisted men came up to me. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you." For what I asked. He shrugged. For not making it worse. I almost laughed. But I didn't. Because I understood what he meant. Sometimes doing your job well means not adding to the problem. Sometimes that's enough. My family never saw those moments. They didn't see the long hours, the quiet decisions, the responsibility that didn't come with applause. They saw absence, distance, a life they couldn't measure. I didn't blame them. Not really. You can't expect someone to value what they don't understand. But my grandfather did. He didn't need to see everything. He just needed to know who I was. I drove a little farther before pulling into a small parking lot near the edge of town. There was a bench there overlooking a stretch of open field that hadn't changed in years. I sat down. For the first time that day, I let myself exhale fully. The trust. The letter. The way the room had shifted. It wasn't about winning. Not in the way they thought. I hadn't taken anything from them. I hadn't proven them wrong. Not directly. But something had changed. Something quiet. Something that couldn't be undone. I took the letter out of my bag. The one the attorney had handed me after everything ended. I hadn't read it again yet. Not properly. I unfolded it carefully. The paper felt different in my hands than it had in that room. More personal. More real. "Emily," it began. No formal tone this time. Just my name. "You may not realize it yet, but the life you chose has already shaped more people than you will ever meet." I paused there. Let it settle. There will be times when it feels like no one is watching, like what you do doesn't reach beyond the moment. I looked out across the field. The wind moved through the grass in slow, steady waves. But impact is not always visible, and recognition is not always immediate. I swallowed. What matters is that you continue anyway. I folded the letter slowly, held it for a moment, then placed it back in my bag. The sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows across the ground. I stood up, took one last look at the field, then walked back to my car, because whatever came next, it wasn't about what I had been given. It was about what I was going to do with it. I didn't go back to the house that evening. There wasn't anything there I needed. Not anymore. Instead, I checked into a small hotel just off the highway, the kind with faded carpet, quiet hallways, and a front desk clerk who barely looked up when you walked in. It was the same place I'd stayed a few times over the years when visits home didn't quite feel like coming home. Some things don't change. And sometimes that's a relief. I set my bag down on the chair by the window. The room smelled faintly of old air conditioning and detergent. Outside, the sky was turning that soft gray blue that comes just before night settles in. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, still in my uniform, hands resting on my knees. The silence didn't feel heavy. Just honest. There's a kind of quiet you learn to live with in the military. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of distraction. You learn to sit with your thoughts. You learn not to run from them. And eventually you learn which ones matter. That night only one thought stayed. Not about the trust. Not about the will. But about something my father had said years ago, something I hadn't thought about in a long time. "You don't need anything from us." At the time I had taken it as dismissal. A quiet way of saying I wasn't part of what they were building. But now, sitting there alone, I realized something different. He hadn't meant to push me away. He had simply placed me somewhere else. Somewhere he didn't know how to reach. The next morning I woke early. Old habits don't fade. I got dressed, checked out, and drove back toward town, not to the house, but to the one place that had always made sense to me. My grandfather's. It was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing it clearly for the first time. The paint had faded along the edges of the porch. The railing leaned slightly where it always had. The yard was still neat, though someone had been taking care of it. I parked along the side and walked up the steps. They creaked in the same places. I noticed that. I always notice things like that. The front door was locked. Of course it was. But I didn't try to open it. I just stood there for a moment looking at it. Remembering. He used to leave it unlocked during the day. Said there was no reason to keep people out if you weren't afraid of anything inside. I never knew if that was wisdom or just the way he chose to live. Maybe both. I walked around to the back. The porch was still there, same 2 chairs, same small table between them. One of the chairs had a slight tilt to it, the one he always sat in. I stepped onto the porch and sat down. The wood creaked under my weight. For a second it felt like nothing had changed. I figured you'd come here. I turned. My father stood at the edge of the yard. Hands at his sides, no jacket, no tie. Just him. I wasn't sure if you would, I said. He nodded once. I wasn't sure either. He took a few steps closer, then stopped, not quite ready to come all the way up. We stood there like that for a moment. The distance between us wasn't large, but it felt familiar. I didn't know about the trust, he said. I know. He looked at the porch, then at me. He never mentioned it. I nodded. He didn't mention a lot of things. My father exhaled slowly. That's not how I do things. No, I said, it's not. He stepped closer this time. 1 foot on the first step, but no further. I thought I understood him, he said. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure what that would sound like. I thought I understood you too, he added. That got my attention. I looked at him. Really looked. There was something different in his expression now. Not certainty. Not control. Something closer to doubt. I didn't think you needed anything, he said. There it was again. That same sentence. But it didn't sound the same anymore. I didn't, I said. He frowned slightly. Then why does this feel like I missed something? I held his gaze. Because you did. He didn't react right away. Didn't defend himself. Didn't argue. He just stood there letting that settle. I gave your brother what I thought mattered, he said after a moment. I know. And you, he paused, you chose something else. Yes. He nodded slowly. I thought that meant you were separate from all this. I glanced around the yard. The house. The porch. This was never really mine, I said. He looked at me confused. It was your home. It was your home, I corrected gently. And his. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. My father stepped up onto the porch, then finally closing the distance. He didn't sit. Just stood beside me, looking out at the yard the same way I was. I didn't know how to measure what you were doing, he admitted. That felt closer to the truth. You weren't supposed to, I said. He turned slightly. Then what was I supposed to do? I thought about that. Not quickly. Not easily. Ask, I said. He looked away. Toward the fence line. Toward the place where the yard met the open field beyond it. I thought giving you space was respect, he said. It can be, I replied. But not when it replaces understanding. He was quiet again. Longer this time. I watched your brother build something I could see, he said. And I watched you leave. I nodded. That's what it looked like. He let out a breath. But I never asked where you were going. That was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just clear. I didn't need more from you, I said after a while. He looked at me again. Then what did you need? I met his eyes. Not angry. Not hurt. Just honest. To be seen. The words stayed between us. Not heavy, but real. My father didn't answer right away. He just nodded. Once. Slowly. I see you now, he said. I didn't respond. Because that kind of thing, it doesn't come from words. It comes from what happens next. The wind moved through the yard again, brushing against the porch, carrying that same quiet I had always known here. My father looked around one more time. Then back at me. What are you going to do with it? He asked. I followed his gaze out toward the field. Toward something bigger than this house. This town. This moment. I'm going to use it, I said. And for the first time since I'd come back. That answer felt like mine. The paperwork began the following Monday. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a series of meetings, signatures, quiet conversations, the kind of work that builds something real without ever drawing attention to itself. I stayed in town longer than I'd planned. Not because I had to, but because this mattered. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, old framed certificates, a desk that looked like it had held decades of decisions that didn't need to be explained to anyone else. He greeted me with a firm handshake. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, "I'm glad you came in." "So am I replied. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Let's talk about what your grandfather left you." He didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. He explained everything carefully, how the trust had been built, where the funds were held, how the structure worked. It wasn't just a single account. It was layered, planned, intentional. "Your grandfather began this nearly 10 years ago," he said. I looked up. "Then," he nodded. "Small at first, then consistent." He added to it regularly. I sat back slightly. 10 years. That meant he had started this long before his health declined, long before anyone thought about wills or estates. He had been building this quietly, while the rest of us were living our lives unaware. "He never mentioned it," I said. The attorney smiled faintly. "That seems consistent with what I knew of him." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, detailed records, investment summaries, notes. But what caught my attention wasn't the numbers. It was the purpose. "This isn't just a financial structure," he said. "It's a mission." I nodded. "I understand that." He studied me for a moment. "I believe you do," he said. "There were conditions, of course. Not restrictive ones, guiding ones. The fund was designed to support veterans transitioning back into civilian life, especially those who didn't have strong family support. Housing assistance, job training, emergency support. Nothing excessive. Nothing showy. Just practical help. The kind that actually makes a difference." He was very clear about one thing, the attorney added. "What's that?" I asked. "That this fund should never become performative." I almost smiled. That sounds like him. The meetings continued throughout the week. Account managers, advisors, a small board that had been quietly assembled. People who had known my grandfather in different ways, some from his past, some from his later years. All of them steady. No one treated me like an outsider. No one questioned why I was there. They simply included me. On Wednesday, we visited one of the properties tied to the trust. A modest building on the edge of town. Nothing impressive from the outside. But inside, it was already being used. A small group of veterans sat in a common room talking quietly. Coffee on the table, papers spread out. One of them looked up as we entered. "Ma'am," he said, nodding. I nodded back. "Morning." The attorney spoke with the coordinator, giving me space to observe. I noticed things. The way people sat. The way they held themselves. The small, almost invisible tension that comes from adjusting to a life that doesn't move the same way anymore. I recognized it. Because I had felt it. One of the men stood up and walked over. Mid-40s maybe, worn but not broken. "You new here?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not exactly." He nodded like that made sense. "Place helps," he said after a moment. "How so?" I asked. He shrugged. "Gives you somewhere to land." Somewhere to land. I repeated that in my head. Because that was exactly what this was. Not a solution. Not a fix. Just a place to start again. Later that afternoon, the attorney handed me a set of finalized documents. "This will formally transfer operational control to you," he said. I took them. Felt the weight of them. Not heavy. But significant. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. I looked at the pages. Then at him. "I've been ready for a long time," I said. He nodded. I believe that. The signing itself was quiet. No audience. No announcement. Just a pen. A name. And a responsibility that had been waiting for me long before I knew it existed. When it was done, I sat there for a moment. Not moving. Not thinking. Just present. "You understand," the attorney said gently, "that this isn't something you complete. It's something you continue." I nodded. "I know." He stood extending his hand. "Then I think your grandfather chose well." That evening I drove back to the house. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. My father was in the living room when I walked in. No TV on. No papers in his hands. Just sitting there. You're still in town, he said. I am. He nodded. We didn't talk right away. Didn't need to. How did it go? He asked after a while. Good, I said. That's good. He looked at me then. Not quickly. Not casually. But with intention. What exactly is it? He asked. I thought about how to answer that. Not in terms he would expect, but in terms he could understand. It's support, I said. For people who don't always have it. He nodded slowly. And you're in charge of that now. Yes. Another pause. That's a lot of responsibility, he said. It is. He leaned back slightly, studying me again. But this time, there was no confusion. Your grandfather always believed in things I didn't fully understand, he said. I didn't respond. I just let him continue. I thought I was building something solid, he said. You were. He shook his head slightly. But I think he was building something lasting. That stayed with me. Because there's a difference between something that holds value and something that carries meaning. I think you're right, I said. He looked at me again, then nodded. And for the first time, there was no distance in it. The first real decision didn't come with a meeting. It came with a phone call. Late Thursday afternoon. I was still in town going over final notes with the coordinator from the center we'd visited earlier in the week. My phone rang. Unknown number. I stepped outside to take it. This is Whitaker, I said. There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation, just someone deciding how to begin. Ma'am, a voice said, my name's Daniel Ruiz. I was given your number through the fund. I leaned slightly against the railing. Yes, Mr. Ruiz, how can I help? Another pause. I'm not sure, he said honestly. I was told, you might be able to point me in the right direction. That more than anything told me exactly where he was. We talked for about 15 minutes. He didn't tell me everything. People rarely do on the first call. But he told me enough. Former Army. Recently discharged. No steady housing. A job lined up, but it didn't start for another 3 weeks. He wasn't asking for much. Just time. I've got a place I can stay for a couple nights, he said. After that, I'm not sure. I looked out across the parking lot. Thought about the building we'd visited. The empty room I'd noticed near the back. You're in town, I asked. Yes, ma'am. Come by tomorrow morning, I said, 9 o'clock. Another pause. Are you sure, he asked? Yes. His voice softened slightly. Thank you. After the call ended, I stayed where I was for a moment. Not thinking about policy. Not thinking about structure. Just thinking about him. This was what my grandfather had built. Not a concept. Not an idea. A place where someone could call and not be turned away. The next morning I arrived early. Old habit. I walked through the building checking things not because I didn't trust the people there, but because I needed to understand how it felt when it was quiet. When it wasn't performing for anyone. Daniel arrived at 8:57. I noticed that. Clean clothes, worn boots, carried himself straight but with that same quiet tension I'd seen before. He hesitated slightly at the door. I walked over. Mr. Ruiz. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Come on in. We sat down at a small table near the window. No paperwork yet. No forms. Just conversation. Tell me what you need, I said. He took a breath. Just somewhere to stay, he said. A couple weeks. I've got a job starting soon. I just need to get there. I nodded. You will. He looked at me unsure. You don't know that, he said. I met his gaze. Yes, I said, I do. We got him set up in less than an hour. Temporary housing, access to meals, a small stipend to bridge the gap. Nothing excessive. Everything necessary. As he was leaving the office, he paused. Turned back. I appreciate this, he said. You don't owe us anything, I replied. He shook his head slightly. Still, he said, it matters. After he left, I stood by the window for a while, watching him walk across the lot. Shoulders a little lighter. Steps a little more certain. That was the moment it became real. Not the signing. Not the documents. This. Later that afternoon, my brother called. I hadn't expected that. I answered anyway. Hey, he said. Hey. A pause. I've been thinking, he added. I figured. He let out a small breath. About everything, the will, the trust, all of it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't realize how much he had set aside, he said. He planned ahead, I replied. Yeah, he said, he did. Another pause. I got the penthouse, he said finally. And the Tesla. Yes. It's a lot, he said. It is. But it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. I didn't answer right away. Because I knew that feeling. What does it feel like, I asked. He hesitated. Like I got what I wanted, he said. But not what he meant. That was honest. More honest than I expected. He didn't choose against you, I said. I know, he replied quickly. I think I know. He chose based on what he believed each of us needed, I added. There was a long silence on the line. I don't know if I needed this, my brother said. You might, I said. Or you might learn something from it. He gave a quiet laugh. That sounds like something he would have said. It does, I agreed. Another pause. Then, what you're doing with that fund, he said, that's different. It is. I went by the building yesterday, he admitted. I raised an eyebrow slightly. You did? Yeah, I didn't go in, just looked. And I asked. I didn't understand it, he said. But I could tell it mattered. That was enough. You're welcome to come by, I said. He didn't answer right away. Maybe I will, he said finally. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly. Things don't change all at once. Not people. Not families. But sometimes they start. That evening, I sat down at my desk in the small office at the center. The same one my grandfather had used. Simple, clean, functional. I opened a new folder. Labeled it. Not with my name. With the funds. Because this wasn't about me. Not really. It was about continuing something that had already begun. And for the first time, I understood what winning actually meant. The first letter came 3 weeks later. Not an official report, not a document. Just a handwritten note folded neatly and left on my desk. I recognized the handwriting before I even opened it. Danielle Ruiz? Ma'am. I started the job this week. It's nothing fancy, warehouse work, early hours. But it's steady. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for the place to stay. For not making me feel like I had to explain everything. That mattered more than I expected. Ruiz. I read it twice. Then I set it down gently. Not because it was fragile, but because it meant something. People don't always remember what you give them, but they remember how you make them feel while they're receiving it. My grandfather understood that. He never gave in a way that made you feel small. He gave in a way that made you feel steady. By the end of the month, we had helped 7 more. Not dramatic cases, not headlines. Just people in between chapters. A place to land. Time to reset. A quiet hand forward. Word spread the way things like that always do. Slowly. Through conversations. Through trust. One afternoon, a local reporter stopped by. Young, polite, curious. I heard about the fund, she said. Would you be willing to talk about it? I considered that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what my grandfather would have said. Keep it about the people it helps, I replied. She nodded. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The article ran the following Sunday. Simple. Respectful. Focused. It mentioned the fund, the purpose, a few anonymous stories. And at the end, my name. I didn't think much of it. Until my father called. I saw the paper, he said. Yeah. Yes. A pause. They used your name. They did. Another pause. I didn't know you were doing all of that, he said. I leaned back slightly in my chair. That's kind of the point, I said. He didn't answer right away. I showed it to a few people, he said. That caught my attention. You did? Yes. Another pause. I told them, you were my daughter. The words landed quietly. But they stayed. That's the first time you've said it like that, I said. I know, he replied. There was no defense in his voice. No justification. Just acknowledgement. I should have said it sooner, he added. I looked down at the desk. At the letter still resting there. You can say it now, I said. He exhaled softly. "I'm proud of you," he said. The room didn't change. Nothing around me shifted. But something inside me did. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Just settled. "Thank you," I said. We stayed on the line for a moment longer. Not talking. Just there. When the call ended, I sat there quietly. The same way I had so many times before. But this time the silence felt different. Not like something missing. Like something complete. A few days later, my brother showed up. No announcement. No call ahead. Just walked through the door of the center looking slightly out of place. "I figured I'd come see it," he said. I nodded. "Good." He walked slowly through the space, taking it in. The chairs, the desks, the people. "This is what you do now?" he asked. "This is part of it," I said. He nodded. "I always thought success looked different," he admitted. "It usually does," I said. We stopped near the window, the same one I had stood by weeks earlier. "I used to think you left," he said. I glanced at him. "I didn't leave," I said. "I just went somewhere you weren't looking." He let out a quiet breath. "Yeah," he said. "I see that now." We stood there for a while. Not fixing anything? Not rewriting the past. Just understanding it better. That evening, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind. The building was quiet again. The way I preferred it. I sat at the desk. Opened my grandfather's letter one more time. Recognition is not always immediate. I smiled slightly. "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." I folded the letter carefully. Placed it back where it belonged. Then I looked around the room. At what had been built. At what was continuing. Some people leave money. Some leave property. Some leave things that can be counted, measured, divided. But some leave direction. A way forward. And sometimes, that's the only inheritance that truly lasts. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly carried more than anyone ever noticed, take a moment. Reach out. Tell them you see them. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the old ceiling fan clicking above the judge's bench. "She's an imposter," my brother shouted in court. Then a federal agent placed a sealed envelope on the judge's desk. His eyes widened. "Put him in cuffs." My father's face went pale. "Wait, what?" For a moment nobody moved. Not the bailiff, not the lawyers, not even the judge. The entire courtroom in Norfolk County seemed frozen in place like one of those old photographs my mother used to keep in dusty albums upstairs. The only sound came from my brother Daniel's breathing. Fast, uneven, panicked. Then the bailiff stepped forward. "Sir, stand up and place your hands behind your back." Daniel blinked like he hadn't heard correctly. "What? No, this is insane. She's the liar. She's the one." "Now, sir." The handcuffs clicked loudly enough to echo against the wooden walls. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my hands folded in my lap. 30 years in the Navy had taught me something important. Panic spreads quickly. Calm spreads slower, but it lasts longer. My father stood halfway from his chair in the gallery, gripping the wooden bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. "There's been a mistake," he said shakily. "My son didn't do anything." The federal agent didn't even look at him. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes before turning toward me. "Commander Evelyn Brooks," he said carefully, "why was this court not informed of your federal status earlier?" I answered quietly. "Because I was trying to keep this a family matter, Your Honor." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Family," he snapped. "You disappeared for 30 years. That one landed harder than I expected. Not because it was true. Because part of me had spent most of my life afraid it was." The judge ordered a recess. People immediately began whispering around the courtroom. Norfolk wasn't a large enough city for scandals like this to stay quiet long, especially not ones involving federal investigators and military records. I stayed seated while my attorney, Linda Carver, leaned closer to me. "You all right?" "I've been better." She gave me a small nod. Linda was around my age, late 50s, sharp as a tack with silver hair she refused to dye. She'd spent 20 years handling military family cases around coastal Virginia. "You understand this changes everything now," she said. "I know. You still want to keep the financial records sealed from the press." I looked over toward my father. "Frank Brooks, 79 years old. Korean War veteran's son. Worked 42 years at the shipyard before retirement. Proud man, hard man. And at that moment he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Yes, I told her softly. No matter what Daniel did, he's still my father's son. Linda studied me for a second like she was trying to understand something. Then she sighed. You Navy people are built different. I almost smiled at that. Almost. Across the room, Daniel was arguing loudly with the federal marshals, while another man in a dark suit opened a thick file folder. The sealed envelope sat on the judge's bench like a live grenade. That envelope had changed everything in less than 60 seconds. And the strange thing was, I never wanted it opened in the first place. 3 months earlier, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a Virginia courtroom while my own brother got arrested for fraud connected to my Navy records, I would have laughed in their face. Back then, my biggest concern had been retirement. I'd retired from the Navy the previous fall after 30 years of service. Commander Evelyn Brooks, logistics and operations support, nothing glamorous, no movie-worthy stories. Mostly long deployments, paperwork, classified transport coordination, and years spent helping younger sailors survive careers that could swallow whole marriages and families. I rented a modest condo near Chesapeake Bay after retirement. Quiet place, good fishing nearby, older neighbors who minded their business. For the first time in decades, life had slowed down. Then my mother died. That phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Daniel called me from Norfolk General Hospital. You better come now, he said flatly, if you even care. No hello. No warning. Just that. I remember staring out my kitchen window at the rain running down the glass while my coffee turned cold beside me. When did it happen? About an hour ago. I closed my eyes. What about Dad? He's devastated. There was accusation tucked inside every word he spoke. There always had been. I'll be there tonight, I said. You should have come sooner. Then he hung up. That was Daniel. My younger brother had a gift for making every conversation feel like a trial. By the time I arrived at my parents' house the next evening, casseroles already lined the kitchen counters. Church friends filled the living room, speaking in hushed voices, while old country music played softly from the radio. My father barely looked at me when I walked in. You made it, he said. Not good to see you. Not your mother missed you. Just that. You made it. I hugged him anyway. His body felt fragile beneath his flannel shirt. Daniel stood near the dining room holding court like he owned the place. He shook hands, accepted condolences, told stories about helping Mom through her final weeks. If you listened long enough, you'd think he'd carried the whole family alone. And maybe in some ways he believed he had. Evelyn. I turned and saw my Aunt Ruth pulling me into a hug. You look tired, sweetheart. I drove straight through. She talked about you all the time, Ruth whispered. That caught me off guard. She did. Oh, honey, constantly. Before I could answer, Daniel walked over holding 2 cups of coffee. 1 cream, no sugar, he said, handing me one. I stared at it for a second. He remembered. After all these years, he still remembered how I took my coffee. Thanks, I said quietly. For one brief moment, standing there in my parents' kitchen with rain tapping against the windows and mourners speaking softly nearby, I thought maybe grief had changed us. Maybe losing Mom had finally stripped away decades of resentment. Maybe we could still become a family before it was too late. I had no idea then that my brother had already stolen nearly everything my mother left behind. And I certainly had no idea the federal government was about to enter our lives. When people ask me today whether favoritism can destroy a family, I tell them this. It rarely destroys a family all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, like rust underneath an old truck. By the time you finally see the damage, the whole frame is already cracked underneath. That was my family. And looking back now, I think my mother spent most of her life trying to hold together 2 men who never truly understood each other, my father and my brother. I was simply the person standing between them. I grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, back when the shipyard still ruled everything. My father, Frank Brooks, worked maintenance at Norfolk Naval Shipyard 6 days a week. He believed in hard work, country music, black coffee, and keeping your feelings to yourself. He also believed boys mattered more. Not cruelly, not openly. Men of his generation rarely said things outright. It showed up in smaller ways. Daniel got praised for effort. I got criticized for results. If Daniel brought home a C in math, Dad slapped him on the back and said, "Well, at least you tried." If I brought home an A-, he'd ask why it wasn't an A. That was simply the weather system inside our house. You stopped questioning it after a while. My mother Lorraine tried her best to balance things. She'd sneak encouragement into ordinary moments while washing dishes or folding laundry. "You're steady," she used to tell me. "People trust steady." At the time, I didn't understand how valuable those words would become. Daniel was 3 years younger than me, and born with the kind of charm that fills a room before a person even speaks. Teachers loved him, girls loved him, coaches loved him. Dad adored him. And honestly, for a long time I did too. When we were children, Daniel followed me everywhere. We built forts behind the garage, rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, shared comic books and peanut butter sandwiches during summer storms. But something shifted when we became teenagers. Maybe it was because I stopped trying to please people. Or maybe Daniel noticed before I did that our father measured worth differently between sons and daughters. Either way, the distance started growing early. I remember one particular night during my senior year of high school. Dad had come home exhausted from work. His back hurt constantly by then, though he never admitted it. Daniel had just made varsity baseball. The whole dinner table revolved around him. Mom cooked pot roast, Dad talked baseball statistics. Daniel laughed and replayed every moment from practice. I mostly listened. Then Dad looked over at me. "So," he said, cutting into his meat, "you finally decide what college you're applying to." I set down my fork. "I'm not going to college." The room went quiet. Mom looked up first. "What do you mean?" "I talked to a Navy recruiter today." Dad actually laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind adults use when they think someone said something foolish. "The Navy." "Yes, sir." "For what secretarial work?" I swallowed hard. "No, sir, logistics operations." Daniel smirked. "You get seasick riding ferries." I was 12. Dad leaned back in his chair slowly. "You're serious about this?" "I am." He stared at me for several seconds before shaking his head. "I don't understand girls these days." "Girls. Not women. Not daughters. Girls." Mom tried to smooth things over. "Frank, the military can be a good opportunity." "For boys," he interrupted. I still remember the heat rising into my face. "With respect, Dad, women serve too. Not in combat." "I didn't say combat." "You know what I mean." The conversation ended there, but something permanent changed in the room that night. For the first time in my life, I realized my father had already decided who I was allowed to become. And I realized something else too. I wasn't going to ask permission anymore. 3 months later, I left for boot camp. Mom cried at the bus station. Dad shook my hand like I was a distant neighbor. Daniel didn't come at all. The Navy changed me fast. Not because it made me tougher, because it made me quieter. There's something about military life civilians don't fully understand unless they've lived beside it. The constant movement, the uncertainty, the way entire years disappear while everyone back home keeps aging without you. You miss funerals, birthdays, anniversaries. Your parents get older in photographs instead of in front of your eyes. And every time you come home, the world feels slightly unfamiliar. Especially for women in the service back then. People today forget how difficult it could be during the 80s and 90s. You had to prove competence constantly. One mistake followed you forever. Men could be difficult and still respected. Women had to be nearly flawless. I learned quickly that emotions were dangerous in professional spaces. So I became disciplined instead. Reliable. Steady. Exactly what my mother always said. Over time, promotions came, then overseas assignments, then classified operational support work I rarely discussed even with family. Every Christmas I mailed gifts home. Every birthday I called. And every conversation with Dad lasted under 5 minutes. "How's work?" "Fine." "You staying safe?" "Yes, sir." "Well, good." Click. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed in Norfolk. He bounced between jobs for years: auto sales, roofing a failed landscaping business. But somehow Dad always described him as finding his footing. By his 40s, Daniel had become the kind of man who always needed rescuing financially, while somehow remaining everyone else's favorite. And my mother kept rescuing him. Car payments, rent, credit cards, little emergencies that never seemed to end. I helped too, though, quietly. When Dad's arthritis surgeries got expensive, I wired money. When Mom needed home repairs, I paid anonymously through a contractor friend. I never told them. Not because I wanted credit. Because I already knew who would receive it. Daniel. Your brother's been helping us so much lately, Mom would say warmly on the phone. And I would simply answer, I'm glad. That became my role in the family. The distant daughter. The dependable wallet. The woman nobody fully understood. Then came the phone call about Mom's stroke. And for the first time in decades, I came home planning to stay longer than a weekend. I truly believed grief might heal us. Instead, grief exposed everything that had been rotting underneath for years. Especially my brother. My mother's funeral took place on a gray Saturday morning, under low coastal clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. That felt appropriate somehow. Everything in our family had always hovered on the edge of something heavier. The church sat only 15 minutes from the naval shipyard where my father had spent most of his adult life. Red brick, white steeple, narrow stained glass windows that turned sunlight blue and gold across the pews. I arrived early wearing a simple black dress and my old pearl earrings, the ones Mom gave me before my first overseas deployment. You should have something beautiful when you travel, she'd said. I touched those earrings 3 times before entering the church. Old habit. Navy life teaches you rituals for calming nerves. Inside, Daniel already stood near the front greeting people like a politician during campaign season. His tie was perfect. His smile practiced. His voice carried just enough grief to sound convincing. There she is, he announced when he saw me. My sister finally made it. A few heads turned. That word finally hung in the air on purpose. I ignored it. I came as fast as I could. Well, he said with a shrug, Mom waited a long time. Same smile. Same knife underneath. I glanced toward my father sitting alone in the front pew. He looked smaller every time I saw him now. His shoulders rounded, his hands spotted with age. Grief had hollowed out his face in only a few days. I sat beside him quietly. Morning, Dad. He nodded without looking at me. You speak with the pastor yet? Last night. That's good. Then silence again. I used to think silence meant peace when I was younger. Now I understood silence could also mean exhaustion. The service itself was beautiful. Simple, honest, exactly what my mother would have wanted. Pastor Green spoke about kindness, patience, and quiet service to others. He mentioned Mom volunteering at church suppers, organizing donation drives, helping military wives while their husbands deployed. Then he said something that caught me off guard. Lorraine Brooks spent her life making people feel less alone. I nearly broke right there. Because it was true. Mom had spent decades cushioning sharp edges inside our family, smoothing arguments, excusing behavior, filling emotional holes before anyone else noticed them. And now she was gone. After the burial, everyone gathered back at the house for food and coffee. The same little ranch-style home where I'd grown up. Nothing inside had changed much. Same wallpaper, same squeaky kitchen floor, same faint smell of cigarette smoke trapped inside curtains from 20 years ago. Only now the house felt strangely unprotected. Like the person holding it together had finally let go. Church friends filled the dining room carrying casseroles and pies, while old family acquaintances approached me one after another. Your mother was proud of you. She kept your Navy photos on the mantle. She talked about you constantly. Every single comment surprised me. Because my father rarely talked about my career at all. Neither did Daniel. Over time I'd started assuming my mother didn't either. But apparently she had. Constantly. That realization sat heavy in my chest all afternoon. At one point I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath and noticed Daniel coming downstairs from my parents' bedroom carrying a small metal lockbox. He froze when he saw me. What's that? Paperwork. For what? Estate stuff. I frowned slightly. Already. He gave me an irritated look. Somebody has to handle things, Evelyn. The way he said my name always sounded like criticism. I can help. I've been helping for years. There it was again. That resentment. Not loud. Just simmering beneath everything. Before I could answer, he brushed past me toward the kitchen carrying the box. Something about the interaction stayed with me. Not because of the lockbox itself. Because Daniel looked nervous. That evening after most guests left, I sat alone on the back porch watching dusk settle over the neighborhood. The air smelled like wet grass and salt from the bay. Dad eventually stepped outside holding 2 beers. Without speaking, he handed me one. We sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, he said, "Your mother hated when you two fought." I stared out into the yard. "We barely talk enough to fight." "That's not true." "No." He sighed heavily. "You always judged your brother." I actually laughed softly at that. Daniel's 55 years old. So somebody should have expected responsibility from him by now. Dad's expression hardened immediately. He stayed. There it was. The real issue. Not money. Not arguments. Not old resentment. I left. That was the unforgivable thing. He stayed with you and Mom-Dad continued. He handled doctors' medications, hospital visits. And I sent money every month. He looked surprised. "What?" I took a slow sip of beer. "For years." "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." Dad shook his head instantly. "Daniel helped with expenses. Daniel transferred the payments." The silence afterward felt different. Uncomfortable. Confused. Dad stared out toward the yard for several long seconds. "Well," he muttered, "finally he never said that." Of course he didn't. I almost explained everything then. The mortgage payments. The repair bills. The medical expenses. But I stopped myself. Because deep down I already understood something painful. Dad didn't really want the truth. He wanted the version of the family that made him comfortable. And Daniel had spent years building exactly that version for him. The next morning I woke early and started helping clean the house. While organizing kitchen paperwork, I noticed several overdue notices tucked beneath a pile of magazines. Electric bills. Insurance warnings. Past due pharmacy balances. That made no sense. I knew how much money I'd been sending. Later that afternoon, while Dad napped in his recliner, I quietly asked Mom's longtime friend Gloria if things had been difficult financially. Gloria hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "Your mother was worried near the end." "About what?" "She thought somebody was moving money around." Cold spread through my stomach. "What do you mean?" Gloria looked toward the living room. She didn't trust some of the papers Daniel had her signing. I felt suddenly wide awake. "What papers?" She didn't say exactly. "When was this?" "Maybe 6 months ago." My pulse started pounding slowly. Not panic. Training. Focus. There's a moment during Navy operations when your instincts quietly tell you something underneath the surface is wrong. I'd learned never to ignore that feeling. That night after Dad went to bed, I searched through the kitchen file cabinet looking for insurance documents. Instead, I found missing bank statements, withdrawal slips, property transfer paperwork, and one signature that made my blood run cold. My mother's name. Signed shakily. Dated 3 days after her stroke. I stared at the page for a long time. Then I turned to the final section. Witnessed by Daniel Brooks. Suddenly the hallway light flipped on. Daniel stood there. His expression changed instantly when he saw the papers in my hands. "You shouldn't be going through that." I stood slowly. "What is this?" "Legal paperwork." She signed this after the stroke. So, she could barely speak. His jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "How much did you take?" The question hit him harder than I expected. Not outrage. Fear. Real fear. Then his face hardened. "You know what your problem is, Evelyn?" I said nothing. "You disappear for decades and come back acting like some damn hero. I asked you a question, and I'm tired of answering to you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mom knew who actually stayed around here." I looked down again at the shaking signature on the paper. For the first time in my life, I realized my brother might not simply be selfish. He might actually be dangerous. I didn't sleep much after finding those papers. The old house creaked all night, the way older homes do near the coast pipes, knocking softly floorboards, settling wind brushing against siding worn down by decades of salt air. Every sound seemed louder because my mind refused to quiet down. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m, staring at copies of withdrawal slips and transfer forms. Something wasn't right. And deep down, I think I already knew it was bigger than ordinary greed. At 6:30 the next morning, I brewed coffee while watching the sunrise through the curtains above the sink. Mom used to stand in that exact spot every morning humming Patsy Cline songs while packing Dad's lunchbox. The memory hit harder than expected. Grief works that way at our age. It doesn't arrive dramatically anymore. It sneaks up quietly in ordinary moments. The scrape of a chair. A familiar perfume. An empty room that still feels occupied. I heard Dad shuffling down the hallway before I saw him. "You're up early," he muttered. "Couldn't sleep." He poured himself coffee and lowered into his chair, carefully wincing from arthritis. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then I slid one of the bank statements across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "You tell me." He adjusted his glasses. I watched confusion slowly spread across his face. "This account had 30,000 in it last year," I said quietly. "Now it's almost empty." Dad frowned. "Your mother handled savings." "Did she?" He looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" I reached for another document. "These transfers started after her stroke." He stared at the paperwork silently. "That can't be right." "It is." His face tightened immediately. "You accusing your brother of something?" "I'm asking questions." "You've been home 3 days." "And in 3 days I found missing money." Dad pushed the papers away angrily. "You always think the worst of him." That sentence settled over the kitchen like old smoke. "Always." "Not sometimes." "Always." I leaned back slowly. "Dad, when was the last time you actually reviewed your accounts yourself?" His silence answered for him. That scared me more than the missing money. Older parents trust familiarity, especially fathers like mine. Men raised believing family loyalty mattered more than paperwork. Daniel understood that. And if I was right, he'd been exploiting it for years. Around noon, I drove to the bank branch listed on the statements. The manager, a woman named Cynthia Harper, recognized my last name immediately. "Oh, your mother was lovely," she said warmly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you." I explained that I was helping organize estate paperwork and needed clarification on several recent transfers. The second she reviewed the account activity, her expression changed slightly. Not alarm. Caution. "I'm afraid I can't discuss certain details without legal authorization." That answer told me plenty already. I handed over my identification. "Retired Navy commander." Executor inquiry paperwork from my attorney. Cynthia studied everything carefully before lowering her voice. Mrs. Brooks came in several times before her stroke, expressing concerns. Ice slid down my spine. "What kind of concerns?" "She believed someone was pressuring her financially." "Did she say who?" Cynthia hesitated too long. That was answer enough. "Were these signatures verified?" "Some were signed electronically. My mother barely used email." Again that hesitation. Then Cynthia finally said the sentence that changed everything. "There may already be a pending review." I stared at her. "A review by who?" "I'm not authorized to discuss that." Military training teaches you how to read people under pressure. And at that moment, Cynthia Harper looked genuinely nervous. Not about me. About the situation itself. I left the bank and immediately called Linda Carver. She listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Do you trust your brother?" "Number. Do you trust your father?" The question caught me off guard. With what? The truth. I looked out across the parking lot toward the gray Chesapeake sky. "I don't know anymore." Linda sighed softly. "Come see me tomorrow morning." The next 48 hours unraveled fast. Linda's office overlooked downtown Norfolk, only a few blocks from the waterfront. Framed Navy photographs lined her walls beside degrees and legal certificates. After reviewing the documents, she sat back slowly. "This isn't simple inheritance fraud." "What do you mean?" She tapped one form carefully. These account numbers connect to federal survivor benefit deposits. I frowned. Military benefits. Yes. My stomach tightened immediately. After my mother's health declined several years earlier, I'd arranged additional survivor assistance connected to certain classified service compensation programs. Legal, approved, quiet. Very quiet. Only limited people even knew those funds existed. Including Daniel. How bad is this, I asked. Linda removed her glasses. If someone redirected federal military-related payments using forged authorization, she paused. Potentially very bad. The room suddenly felt smaller. What happens now? We investigate carefully. But somebody else was already investigating. I discovered that 3 days later. I was helping Dad sort through garage shelves when a dark sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 men stepped out. One wore a plain suit. The other wore navy dress whites. Dad stiffened immediately. Who the hell is that? The uniformed officer approached calmly. Commander Evelyn Brooks. Yes. He handed me identification. Special Agent Marcus Hale. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. NCIS. Dad looked utterly confused. What's this about? Agent Hale remained professional but respectful. We've been attempting to contact Commander Brooks regarding irregular access tied to military benefit records. Daniel walked out from inside the house, right then carrying a beer. The second he saw the agents, all color drained from his face. That reaction told me everything. Mr. Brooks, Agent Hale said evenly, we'd like to ask you several questions. Daniel recovered fast. What is this, some kind of joke? No, sir. Dad stepped forward angrily. My son hasn't done anything. The agent ignored him. Sir, were you involved in submitting digital verification forms related to Commander Brooks's military records? Daniel laughed too loudly. I don't know anything about military forms. Interesting, Hale replied calmly, because your IP address appears on several encrypted submissions. Silence. Complete silence. I watched Daniel carefully. His hands were shaking. Tiny tremors. Fear again. Real fear. Dad looked between all of us helplessly. Daniel. My brother suddenly pointed toward me. She told me to handle paperwork. I stared at him in disbelief. What? You were never here. Somebody had to take care of things. Agent Hale's expression hardened slightly. Sir, falsifying federal military documentation carries significant criminal penalties. Dad finally exploded. This is ridiculous. He's her brother. The older agent beside Hale finally spoke for the first time. Sir, he said quietly, family fraud is one of the most common financial crimes against elderly Americans. That sentence hit my father like a slap. Because suddenly this wasn't just about us anymore. It was something uglier. More common. More real. Daniel looked trapped now. Cornered animals either collapse or attack. My brother chose attack. 2 days later, he filed formal accusations against me in county court, claiming I manipulated our mother financially using classified military influence. Linda read the complaint twice before muttering, well, your brother just made the worst mistake of his life. Because once Daniel dragged federal military records into open court, the Navy stopped treating this like a private family dispute. And somewhere behind closed doors, somebody prepared a sealed envelope with my name on it. By the morning of the hearing, the rain had finally arrived. A cold April rain. The kind that turns Norfolk streets silver before sunrise and makes old people complain about their knees over diner coffee. I stood alone beside the courthouse window watching water slide down the glass while adjusting the cuffs of my navy blue blazer. Not uniform, just civilian clothes. I hadn't worn dress whites in almost 8 months. Retirement still felt strange on my shoulders. You look calm, Linda said beside me. I'm trying. You succeeding? Not really. She smiled faintly. Good, nervous people stay sharp. The courthouse itself was old Virginia brick and polished wood built sometime back in the 1940s. You could smell old paper in the hallways, old money, old arguments. The kind of place where generations of families brought their worst moments. Divorces, custody fights, probate disputes, and now us. I spotted Dad sitting near the far end of the hallway with Daniel. Neither had noticed me yet. My father looked exhausted. He wore the same brown suit from Mom's funeral hanging looser on him now. Daniel sat beside him talking rapidly, leaning forward, performing confidence. Even from across the hallway I recognized the act. He was scared. Dad finally looked up and saw me. For a brief second something softened in his face. Then Daniel noticed me too. The softness disappeared immediately. Daniel stood first. Well, he called loudly enough for nearby people to hear "Look who finally showed up." Linda muttered under her breath. "Charming." I walked toward them calmly. "Morning, Dad." He nodded stiffly. Daniel folded his arms. "You really brought lawyers into this. You filed the lawsuit. You forced me to." There it was again. Nothing was ever Daniel's fault. Not the missing funds, not the forged records, not the lies. Everything simply happened to him. Dad cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe we can still settle this quietly." I looked at him carefully. "Did Daniel tell you about the federal investigation?" Dad's eyes flickered toward his son. He said it's a misunderstanding. Of course he did. Dad. "We're done discussing this," Daniel snapped suddenly. His voice echoed harder than he intended. Several people turned to look. Then I noticed something else. 2 men in dark suits standing near the courthouse entrance. Watching. Not casually. Professionally. Federal. Daniel noticed them too. The color drained from his face for half a second before returning. Linda leaned closer to me. "They're here already." I kept my eyes forward. NCIS. Probably not just NCIS anymore. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. Because once multiple federal agencies become involved, situations stop being private forever. The courtroom filled slowly after that. Mostly lawyers, clerks, a few curious locals, and older couples waiting for unrelated hearings. Norfolk courts always carried a strange mixture of boredom and tension. Lives changed there every day. Usually quietly. At 9 sharp, the bailiff called us to order. Judge Harold Bennett entered wearing half-moon reading glasses and an expression suggesting he was already tired of everybody in the room. We took our seats. Daniel sat across from me beside his attorney, sweating despite the cool temperature. Dad remained in the gallery directly behind him. The hearing began routinely enough. Inheritance dispute. Questions regarding estate transfers. Concerns about competency during signature authorization. Then Daniel's lawyer made a mistake. He tried turning the entire case toward my military record. "Your Honor," he announced confidently, "we believe the defendant has used exaggerated federal credentials to intimidate family members and influence estate matters." Linda immediately stood. Objection. But the judge waived for clarification. The attorney continued. "We are prepared to show inconsistencies regarding Commander Brooks's classified service claims." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The line Daniel should never have crossed. The judge looked toward me. Commander Brooks. Before I could answer, Daniel suddenly stood up himself. "You want to know the truth?" he snapped loudly. His own attorney looked alarmed. "Mr. Brooks." "She's a fraud," Daniel shouted, pointing directly at me. "She disappears for years pretending she's some war hero while the rest of us take care of the family." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Dad looked horrified. But Daniel kept going. "She lies about classified work because nobody can verify it. She's been manipulating everybody for decades." I remained perfectly still. That seemed to anger him even more. "She's an imposter." The word cracked across the courtroom. Then everything changed. The rear doors opened quietly. A man entered wearing a dark federal raincoat beside a woman in navy dress whites. Not ordinary service dress. Investigative command. The room immediately shifted. People sensed authority before a single word was spoken. The woman approached the bench carrying a large sealed envelope stamped with federal markings. Judge Bennett frowned. "What is this?" The federal agent spoke calmly. "Supplemental documentation requested under Federal Review Authority, Your Honor." Daniel's attorney stood abruptly. "We object to—" "You'll sit down," the judge interrupted. The agent handed over the envelope. I watched Judge Bennett open it carefully. Page 1. His expression remained neutral. Page 2. His posture stiffened slightly. Page 3. Everything changed. The color drained from his face. He removed his glasses slowly and reread something. The courtroom had gone completely silent now. Even Daniel stopped breathing. Finally, the judge looked up. Not at me. At Daniel. Then he spoke 4 words. Put him in cuffs. Nobody moved at first, because nobody fully understood what they'd heard. Then the bailiff turned sharply. Sir, stand up. Daniel blinked wildly. What? Stand up now. This is insane, Daniel stammered. What's happening? 2 federal marshals entered immediately from the side doors. Dad rose halfway from his seat. Wait, he barked. What the hell is this? The judge's voice hardened. Mr. Daniel Brooks is being detained pending federal investigation involving fraud, identity falsification, unlawful access to military records, and financial exploitation connected to protected federal benefits. Dad looked physically unsteady. No, that can't be right. Daniel pointed toward me desperately. She told me to handle the paperwork. I finally spoke. No, Daniel, I trusted you to help our parents. The difference mattered. And for the first time in his life, my brother understood nobody could rescue him from it. The marshals cuffed him right there in court. Metal clicking against metal. Dad stared like the world beneath him had suddenly disappeared. Then Judge Bennett turned toward me again. His voice changed completely. Respectful now. Commander Brooks, why exactly was this court not informed of your protected operational status? The room fell silent again. I answered honestly. Because I was trying to protect my family. The judge studied me for several seconds. Then he glanced toward the federal agent. Is the documentation verified? Yes, Your Honor. He nodded slowly. Fully. Completely. Dad looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. Or maybe for the first time in his life seeing me clearly at all. Then he whispered the saddest words I've ever heard from another human being. Evelyn, what did you do all those years? I looked at my father quietly while federal officers led my brother from the courtroom. And the truth was, I wasn't sure how to answer that question anymore. After the courtroom hearing, I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour before realizing I'd crossed the bridge toward Portsmouth without remembering any of it. That happens sometimes after shock. Not dramatic shock like explosions or gunfire. Emotional shock. The kind that settles into your bones slowly after years of holding yourself together. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while I sat parked near the Elizabeth River, watching tugboats move through gray water. My brother had just been arrested. My father looked shattered. And somehow none of it felt victorious. That surprised me most. People think revenge feels triumphant when the moment finally comes. Like fireworks. Like justice descending from heaven. But sitting there alone in my car at 58 years old, all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind carried by people who spent too long trying to earn love from folks who already decided not to give it. My phone rang around noon. Linda. You all right? I think so. That's not convincing. I gave a quiet laugh. No, probably not. She hesitated. Your father asked for your address. That tightened something inside my chest immediately. What did you tell him? Nothing yet. I stared out toward the water. What condition was he in? Honestly, she said softly, he looked like a man who just realized he's been asleep for 20 years. That stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. 3 days later, Dad called. Not Daniel. Not lawyers. Dad. I nearly didn't answer. But I did. Hello. Silence first. Then his voice. Small somehow. Evelyn. Yes, sir. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Could we talk? There are moments in life when entire decades seem to balance on one sentence. This felt like one of them. All right. He asked if I could come by the house. The house. Not home anymore. Just the house. I drove there the following Sunday. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as always. American flags fluttering on porches, lawnmowers humming in distant yards, older couples walking tiny dogs along sidewalks cracked by tree roots. Ordinary American life continuing while our family quietly collapsed behind closed doors. Dad opened the front door before I reached it. He looked older than he had 1 week earlier. Much older. Grief had already hollowed him out after Mom died. Now shame seemed to finish the job. "Thanks for coming." I nodded. Inside the house felt painfully empty without Mom. No music playing softly from the kitchen radio. No smell of cinnamon candles. No voice asking whether anybody wanted coffee. Just silence. Dad gestured toward the kitchen table. We sat across from each other exactly where countless arguments and quiet disappointments had unfolded over the years. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then Dad finally said it. "I went to see Daniel yesterday." I stayed quiet. "He says the government twisted everything." I looked down briefly. "And do you believe him?" Dad rubbed both hands together slowly. "I don't know what to believe anymore. At least it was honest." That mattered. I reviewed the bank records, he continued quietly. "The real ones." His voice cracked slightly on the word real. "There's more missing than I knew." "Yes." "He took money from your mother." Another crack in his voice. "Yes." Dad swallowed hard. I keep thinking about how many times I defended him. I watched the old kitchen clock tick behind him. Funny how ordinary sounds become louder during painful conversations. Tick. 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 Finally, Dad looked at me directly. "Why didn't you tell me about the money you were sending?" I answered honestly. "Because you would have credited Daniel for it anyway." That landed hard. He looked away immediately. And for the first time in my entire life, my father truly had no defense ready. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Then he whispered, "I failed you." Simple words. But they seemed to cost him everything. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "You loved him differently." Dad shook his head immediately. "No, I loved him easier." That sentence stunned me. Because it was true. Daniel demanded very little accountability. He stayed nearby, told Dad what he wanted to hear, fit neatly into his understanding of what a son should be. I challenged things. Left home. Joined the Navy. Built a life Dad never fully understood. "You know," he said quietly when you enlisted, "I told people you'd probably quit." I smiled sadly. "I know." His eyes lifted sharply. "How?" "Because Mom told me." That nearly broke him. He covered his mouth with one hand and stared down at the table. "I thought I was protecting you." "From what?" "The world." I shook my head gently. "No, Dad, you were protecting your idea of me." Tears filled his eyes then. Not dramatic crying. Older men from his generation rarely cry openly. But grief leaked through him anyway. "I didn't know how to talk to you after you changed." That sentence unlocked something in me too. Because maybe I hadn't fully understood him either. Men like my father grew up during a different America, one where emotions stayed buried beneath work and routine, one where daughters married local boys and sons carried family names. Then suddenly women entered military careers, leadership roles, federal operations. The world changed faster than some fathers could emotionally keep up. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained part of it. "I waited 30 years for you to say you were proud of me," I admitted softly. Dad closed his eyes. I was. I laughed quietly through sudden tears. "You had a strange way of showing it." He nodded painfully. "Yes, I did." We sat there a long time after that. Not fixing everything. Some damage doesn't repair in one conversation. But for the first time in decades, we were speaking honestly instead of performing family roles. Eventually, Dad stood and disappeared down the hallway. When he returned, he carried a worn cardboard box. "What's this?" "Your mother kept these." Inside were photographs. Letters. Newspaper clippings. Every promotion announcement the Navy ever mailed home. Every photograph I'd ever sent from deployments. Even old articles mentioning humanitarian operations overseas. Mom had saved everything. Dad looked embarrassed suddenly. "She used to make me read your letters out loud." I smiled through tears. She did. Said if I listened long enough, maybe I'd stop pretending you were still 16. We both laughed softly at that. Then Dad reached into the box and pulled out a folded paper. "My Navy retirement ceremony invitation." Still unopened. "I was gonna come," he whispered. I stared at him. "What stopped you?" He answered without looking up. "Daniel said you probably didn't really want us there." The room went very still. 30 years. So many things suddenly made sense. Not all at once, but enough. I finally understood something heartbreaking. My brother hadn't only stolen money. He'd spent years stealing connection itself, separating people slowly, twisting conversations, redirecting love. And my father had let it happen because believing Daniel was easier than questioning him. Dad looked at me carefully then. Is there any way back from this? I thought about that for a long time before answering. Yes, I said finally, but it's slow. He nodded. I got time. And for the first time in my life, I believed he meant it. Daniel accepted a plea agreement 3 months later. No prison drama. No emotional courtroom confession. Real life is quieter than television. He pled guilty to financial fraud, unlawful access to protected records, and elder exploitation involving federal benefit funds. Because he cooperated eventually and had no violent criminal history, the sentence was lighter than many people expected. 4 years in federal prison. Restitution payments. Permanent felony charges. When the hearing ended, he glanced back at me only once before deputies escorted him away. I wish I could tell you I felt satisfaction. I didn't. I mostly felt grief. Not just for what Daniel became, for what we all allowed ourselves to become together. Families rarely collapse because of one villain. Usually collapse happens through years of silence, avoidance, pride, and people refusing to ask difficult questions. That realization stayed with me long after the court case ended. Life settled into a slower rhythm after that. Dad started calling every Sunday morning around 8. Always the same opening. You awake? Yes, sir. Good. Thought maybe we could get breakfast. At first, the conversation stayed careful, surface-level things, weather, football, yard maintenance, local news. But slowly, honesty began slipping into the spaces between us. One morning at a diner near Chesapeake Bay, Dad stared down at his coffee and quietly admitted, "You know what scares me most?" "What?" "That your mother saw all this coming before I did." I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. She probably did. She tried warning me about Daniel sometimes. I looked up. "What did you say?" Dad gave a tired smile. Usually told her she worried too much. That sounded exactly like him. We sat beside the window watching gulls circle over the water. Finally he whispered, "She deserved better from both of us." I nodded once. Yes, she did. The strangest part about reconciliation at our age is how ordinary it looks from the outside. People expect dramatic speeches and sudden healing. Instead, it's usually tiny things. Dad started asking questions about my Navy years. Real questions. Not polite conversation. Genuine curiosity. What exactly did Logistics Command do? How long were your deployments? Were you scared over there? Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I didn't. Certain operations remained classified even after retirement. But for the first time in my life, my father listened instead of judging. One afternoon, I brought him to a retirement recognition ceremony hosted by a local Navy association. Nothing huge. Just older veterans gathering at a community hall near the harbor. Coffee. American flags. Bad sheet cake from a grocery store bakery. The kind of event younger people might find boring, but older Americans understand deeply. Quiet respect. Shared history. A retired admiral spoke briefly about military families and unseen sacrifice. Then several former officers presented me with a commemorative plaque recognizing 30 years of service. When the applause started, I noticed Dad sitting frozen beside the aisle. Not embarrassed. Overwhelmed. Afterward, an elderly Marine approached him. "You Commander Brooks' father?" Dad nodded. The Marine smiled warmly. "You raised one hell of an officer." I watched my father's face carefully. Pride. Regret. Love. Pain. All arriving at once. On the drive home, he stared silently out the passenger window almost the entire time. Finally, he said, "I spent years thinking strength looked loud." I glanced over. "What do you mean?" Daniel was loud, charming, confident. He shook his head slowly. "You were steady." I mistook quietness for weakness. That sentence stayed with me for days afterward. Because I think many families make that same mistake. The loud child often receives attention. The dependable child quietly carries burdens nobody notices until much later. A month after the ceremony, I started volunteering twice a week at a Veterans Legal Assistance Center in Norfolk. Mostly paperwork, financial guidance, helping older veterans avoid scams. You'd be shocked how many elderly Americans lose savings through family manipulation. Sons, grandchildren, caregivers. Loneliness makes people vulnerable. Trust makes them even more vulnerable. One afternoon, an 82-year-old Korean War widow sat crying across from me because her nephew emptied her bank account while pretending to help manage finances. I reached across the table gently and told her something I wish somebody had told my father years earlier. Love should never require surrendering your dignity. She cried harder after that. So did I once she left. Dad improved slowly over the following months. Not physically. Age keeps collecting its debt eventually. But emotionally. He apologized more. Listened more. Defended me openly when old family acquaintances made ignorant comments about women in the military. One Sunday evening we sat together on folding chairs beside the bay watching fishing boats return at sunset. Dad looked thinner now. Frailer. But somehow lighter too. I wrote Daniel, he said quietly. I turned toward him. How'd that go? He answered. Dad stared out toward the water. He said he spent years resenting you because you actually became the person he pretended to be. That hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel. Because it probably contained truth. Dad sighed heavily. I failed him too, Evelyn. I considered that carefully before answering. Yes, I said softly, but he still made his own choices. That distinction mattered. Parents shape us. But eventually adults become responsible for what they do with the shaping. The sun dipped lower across the water. Orange light stretched across the harbor like melted copper. After a while, Dad asked quietly, You think your mother would forgive us? I smiled faintly. I think Mom forgave people long before they deserved it. He laughed softly through tears. Yeah, that sounds like her. When Dad passed away the following spring from heart complications, we had his memorial service at the same church where we buried Mom. Smaller crowd this time. Quieter. I wore civilian black again instead of dress uniform. After the service, Pastor Green handed me a small envelope Dad had left behind. Inside was a handwritten note. Just one paragraph. I was proud of you long before I knew how to say it. Thank you for giving an old man time to learn the difference between pride and love. I sat alone in my car afterward and cried harder than I had during the funeral itself. Not because everything had been fixed. Because it hadn't. But because in the end we finally stopped lying to each other. And sometimes that's the closest thing families ever get to peace. If you've listened this far, maybe there's someone in your own life you need to call. Maybe someone you misunderstood. Maybe someone who served quietly while louder voices took all the attention. Life moves fast when you're young. But after 60, most of us learn the same truth eventually. The people who love us steadily are often the ones we appreciate too late. If this story touched you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs it. And if you still have time left with the people you love, ask the hard questions now. Before silence answers for them.